think are a little more, I don't know, on the artistic side of mapping. Not that all mapping is art to a certain extent, but spend maybe a little more time working in cartographic design than what a lot of us at WLIA get to on the average day. Give us really a chance to exchange information across and forgive me, I may have just been in another presentation where I rambled for an hour, so I'm switching gears right now. But really just a chance to swap cartographic techniques with a lot of, with the understanding that a lot of the work that we're doing as WLIA members are certainly more of a GIS intensive, let's hurry up and get work done so it's ready for this board meeting tonight sort of work. So really kind of balancing great design with time limitations and the things that we all face within our, rather restricted and constricted work lives at times. So it's great to see everybody. It's great to see, I think this is the first time all 4 of our panelists are on screen at the same time. So Lauren, Daniel, and Sarah, feel free to wave or something. It's great to see all of you, especially since I think we're talking from very literally all different parts of the country. So that is exciting. And both sides of Madison, East and West, are depicted in panel 2. So that covers Daniel and I. I do want to give Laurel a shout out for the moderating and playing the role of the Zoom god for this meeting. So thank you, Laurel, for your great work and also representing my home, Chippewa Valley, on this video screen as well. So I think we're a lot, especially for you folks who were on some of the workshops earlier today, especially the, I would say, partner presentation to this one, the Data VizWiz workshop led by Jamie Dennis, where I think there were a lot of slides throughout that presentation. And I think a lot through other presentations today, what we're looking at having probably a bit more so. Certainly we'll have some slide work and, typical presentation content throughout the afternoon here. But I think what we expect this to be a lot more so will be a lot of Q&A between you all on the Zoom line out there and the 4 of us on the mapping side, Lauren, Sarah, Daniel, and I. So we did ask you all for a few planted questions, if you will. So I think we'll pull some of those up, but feel free absolutely to send mapping questions our way through the chat throughout the course of this afternoon. But to help paint some context, what we're going to do, instead of doing the typical session introductions where we say, Miss So-and-so did such and such for so many years and went to school at such and such and that and such university, we're actually going to go ahead and basically bounce the Zoom screen between the 4 of us, and we'll have about 5 minutes, I think, each, depending on how much everybody wants to talk and how many slides and whatnot, or just visuals everybody has to share, with the idea that we can hopefully paint a picture for you of what our mapping kind of background has been. And hopefully that'll help set the stage for some questions and inquiries out of you all. And then we will have a couple of, here's what a day in the life, or here's what mapping life is like, or project demos throughout the course of our time together this afternoon too. And for those of you who want to plan your water breaks, we should be having them right around 2 o'clock and right around 3 o'clock. So with that, we did not pick a batting order. So between Lauren, Daniel, Sarah, and I, is there anybody who's jumping to talk about themselves and maybe show some of their mapping history first?
I mean, you're the one who's talking now, so I think you should go first.
And here I was thinking, I've been talking for the last hour and 15 minutes, but you do that all the time, Huffman. You're used to this. I can pull up my slides because basically I'm just going to walk through my own history, which some of the WLIA crowd knows, but I'm guessing not everyone. So I'm going to go ahead and just pull up a few slides, and I won't go terribly deep into this, I hope. I also need to find my darling slides. There they are. And get on to sharing screen mode. So just give me a sec. I realized yesterday, as someone who hasn't updated resumes and portfolios in a painfully long time, that even making a 5-slide depiction of my mapping life was more difficult than I expected it to be. So hopefully this is decent and a good reminder that I need to get back on the stick. Can you all see a very quirky looking slide that has something to do with maps? I see a
Yes.
thumbs up from Daniel. So a little summary of the life of Cartographic madness, or the fact that my name offers a mappy pun, so I use it to brand my mapping life. Just a little bit of context of where I've come from. I think 3 out of the 4 of us have very direct UW ties. So, but to work in reverse chronological, I work for the Public Service Commission of Wisconsin, which is a medium-sized state agency here in Madison that's focused on regulating utilities, and in my very specific case, advocating for improved broadband coverage. And in my case, my life is very much tied to grooming the Wisconsin broadband map into a more accurate yet accessible tool for everybody from basically internet network planners to the general public to be able to understand. Before that, I worked in county government down in suburban St. Louis for a couple of years and got used to kind of the mapping life that goes on within that county government, let's chase board meetings system, if you will. Spent a little time out in DC interning for National Geographic, which it's been 10 years and I still romanticize it like I did 10 years ago, which is crazy. Lauren may be able to offer some more context into the life at Nat Geo when she gets a chance to speak. And again, like I think 3 out of the 4 of us have done, I've spent a fair amount of time at the UW geography program here in Madison. And that's a gift that informs what I do to this day. And as time allows, or as I force it, I do freelance and volunteer mapping as well. It's where that Cartographic Maps moniker usually gets dropped. And I think the first recorded map activity that I was tied to dates back to when I was about 4. So one way or another, I've been obsessed with these mappy things seemingly forever, which is really nice. So as I mentioned, a fair amount of my work, especially my bread and butter, is tied to making maps that, of course, fit within, the needs of a state or local government, which I think a lot of you folks know. And with more time, I would have set up a proper poll to get this information out, or to try to get this information from all of you. But I think a lot of us on the government side especially are, kind of constricted to, let's get the functionality taken care of, and the form, we'll make it a little bit pretty if we can. But, we have also got those bosses who are like, why'd you spend all that time making that map look like it does? It looks really good, but it's not a good use of your time. Thankfully, with both of my public sector employers to date, I've generally been able to at least get to a point where I can make stable enough map templates that generally work out, where our end users are able to use the maps properly as they expect. And I think at least decent map design is being employed. Freelance and volunteer work. For me, this is my opportunity to let my crazy side of mapping out a little bit, where I go ahead and do my more experimental stuff. Clients, I don't aim to have a big client load, because this is also gobbling up whatever free time I have, which feels like it isn't much. But I've had the opportunity to make a good series of reference maps over the years, done some work for a few authors, and in part because of my, I don't know, the social media world knows it well enough, because of my own Catholic ties, various Catholic church entities have been tied to my mapping a little bit over the years, enough that if I really want to take a little bit of poking fun at religious things, my best shot at ever maybe being photographed with the Pope might have come through one of my map projects. I believe this is how my map of Milwaukee County's Catholic churches still is displayed at the Archdiocesan Center over in Milwaukee, which is kind of neat and a little humbling, especially if you, and insert that with any other organization that you hold in high accord. But looking at those maps in the back, when I do get a chance, I like to, push the artistic boundaries a little bit, just to see what happens with different styles, which a lot of folks I think get to do, probably not as part of their regular day jobs. It's kind of a labor of love. And speaking of labor of, National Geographic, Lauren's going to give probably a much better summary of that life than I ever could. Part of me realized I don't think I've ever put one of my Nat Geo maps in a slide. So for this one moment, I am, but it was the 3 months I spent there was a good grounding experience of, there's a lot of work that goes into these layouts, and a lot of my work is very behind the scenes, doing some of the GIS updates or working on making that infographic at the bottom of this layout work out like it does. And where I think I'm detail oriented by myself, National Geographic did a good job of, humbling you a little bit and making you realize, there's a lot that goes into, one hell of a mapping production. I mean, you have several staff who are working on a layout like this just to get an individual map in the magazine. And as WLIA certainly knows at this point, there is a labor of love practice that goes into another part of my cartography, the fact that sometimes maps are good to eat. There's been at least one map contest where I entered in a pan of brownies as a map entry, and it did okay. It might have gotten the People's Choice Award. It did not win its own category, and I was stuck eating leftovers for 3 weeks. But now we do things like when we have in-person map conferences, we have the map gallery opening, which involves eating lots of map cookies. And over time, I think I've gotten a few other WLIA members to get in on the madness, like the time that we frosted a bunch of map cookies at the conference hotel before giving them all out to our conference attendees a couple of years ago. Anyway, it's just another application to have fun with them. And I think a big thing for me, regardless of what we're doing in the mapping world, is to try to keep it fun when you can. And I think I've been pretty fortunate in part because I've liked geography, as a lot of us do, for a really long time. It's really easy for me to apply kind of that element of fun into the work that I'm doing. It makes the 9 to 5 bearable and oftentimes pleasurable, which is good. And it gives me a chance and gives me a reason to do this mapping stuff outside of work too, which takes some work. So I think that's a hopefully decent overview. I may have probably talked longer than I should have. Who'd like to go next? Sweet. Lauren's going next, and I get a break. Let me mute myself, and can you grab the screen from us, Lauren? Awesome. So.
Okay, can you all hear me? Awesome. Okay, so I'll give a little brief overview of my background. So my name's Lauren Tierney. I'm a graphics editor and cartographer at the Washington Post. I'll go into a little bit more detail about what we do at the Washington Post and how we make maps later, but just to give a little bit of my background here. So kind of my journey from college to the Washington Post. So I got my undergraduate degree at the University of Oregon. For about my first year or two, I bounced around a couple different majors, and I like to show this journey in that, I feel like a lot of times people happen upon geography and GIS by accident in college. That's at least a story that I experienced, and that a lot of people I went to college with also experienced. And in case we have people early in career here, just showing that journey and kind of that evolution to finding geography. So like I said, I got my undergraduate degree at University of Oregon, double majoring in geography and Spanish, focusing on GIS and physical geography. I stayed on at the University of Oregon. I worked in the infographics lab for 3 years, which is a cartography lab within the Department of Geography there. During my master's, I got my master's degree in geography, and I was focused on spatial analysis and GIS. So not necessarily cartography. My background academically is GIS and spatial analysis, but working in the infographics lab and taking cartography courses there is how I started to combine working with spatial data and making it understandable for a general audience through cartography. After my master's degree, I moved to National Geographic, where I started as a production assistant working with graphic editors to help with their projects, and spent 3 years at National Geographic, working my way up eventually to a graphics editor where I was creating my own maps for the magazine. And then after about 3 years at National Geographic, I moved to the Washington Post, so still based in DC. I've worked at the Washington Post for a little over 3 years now, so I'm approaching about 6 years in DC. And then this also just to highlight, I had a brief moment in journalism in college and then moved away, and then eventually made my way back. At the University of Oregon, like I said, I worked at the infographics lab, which is a cartography lab there at the university. For the 3 years I worked there, I worked on the Wild Migrations Atlas, mapping the ungulates of Wyoming. And on this project, it was a lot of working with GIS data from wildlife biologists and trying to essentially figure out ways to visualize it in a format that would be more approachable to a general audience who would be looking at it in this atlas. After that, of course, I moved to National Geographic, where I started out as an assistant, and then over a couple of years moved my way up to a graphics editor there, creating my own maps in the magazine, and collaborating with reporters across the magazine, and also collaborating with artists and illustrators within our graphics department at National Geographic magazine. These are a couple projects that were collaboration projects, working with other people on the team that specialized in, as I said before, art and illustration. I spent 3 years there at National Geographic, and eventually, as I said, started to work on my own projects that I was pitching to the company stories that were being worked on with the magazine. Two of those projects were a map supplement, which they used to come in National Geographic magazine, but they were the big fold-out posters. So on the right is a map of British Columbia I worked on. And then on the left-hand side, another project that I worked on in my last year at National Geographic, which was mapping climate change in Antarctica. And it was really at National Geographic where I really, both at the infographics lab in grad school, but at National Geographic, just learned different ways to essentially fine tune and move maps to different levels to essentially get to a final product that was going to be most understandable to a general audience. This is a GIF I like to show, just essentially the evolution of this map. This is over the course of about 5 or 6 months. And as you can see, it starts with a really rough pencil draft. And then over the course of a couple months, just starts to get built up, little fine tuning happens to get to the final product at the end. Now I'm at the Washington Post. Like I said, I've been at the Washington Post for 3 years now. I started as a graphics reporter, meaning that I was pitching my own visual stories, making maps to company articles, but then also pitching ideas for maps from our department. Recently, in the last month, I moved to be a graphics editor, which essentially means I'm helping to manage content within our department. So my focus is looking at coverage for local social issues, transportation, education coverage for the graphics department. And so we have different editors who cover foreign. We have different editors that cover politics to help lead the visual content. And at the Washington Post, we obviously make a lot of maps there as well, just like my time at National Geographic. We make a lot of maps responding to breaking news, events going on in the environment, events going on with people around the country and the world. And I'll dive a little bit more into my examples of work we do at the Washington Post later on, but that's just a brief info, and I can escape the share screen. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Lauren. And Daniel and Sarah. Sarah's hand went up first, so
I can go.
Okay.
Yeah. Now I have to share my screen here. Make sure I'm sharing the correct one. Can you all hear me? And what do you see on the screen?
ArcGIS maps. Oh, now I
You see my
see a
face?
Sarah Bell screen.
All right. I wasn't
Yep.
sure if we'd have a camera, so I put a picture of my face, which is what they tell us to do at work. So that is what my face looks like. Excuse me. So Coulter had told us, give about a 5-minute presentation. And I thought he really meant just give a sentence about who you are. So while you all were talking, I put in a couple extra slides from a previous presentation. Yeah, my name is Sarah Bell. I'm a senior product engineer at Esri. And I work as the product engineer on ArcGIS Maps for Adobe Creative Cloud, which is a plugin for Adobe Illustrator and Photoshop that I'm going to demo later on. I'm the former lead, cartography lead of Esri's Cartography Tech Center called the Cartography Lab. And I still get to work in that, but since becoming the product engineer, I work more on when I'm in the tech center, I'm more like in and out than watching a project go from start to finish. And when I'm not doing maps, I'm probably rock climbing or trying to train for rock climbing. So this is one of the slides I just threw in real quick. I'm going to give you a little trajectory of myself too. Just like Lauren was saying, I find that a lot of my cartography friends, including myself, stumble into cartography rather than dreaming about being a cartographer when they were a little kid. And I'm actually kind of grateful that that's how it happened for me. So I got my Bachelor of Arts in Cultural Anthropology in Bellingham, Washington, which is where I am right now at Western Washington University. And then immediately upon graduating, I applied for what was my dream job, National Park Ranger at the North Cascades National Park, which is my favorite place on the planet. So that was really awesome. I learned that park ranger jobs are typically seasonal. So I needed to find a way to make this a permanent gig because it was my dream job. And it's the national park, that particular one, as well as many others, they're called what are called science parks. So they receive a lot of the funding they receive actually employs scientists to understand the park in a scientific way. You know, the national park, the North Cascades has over 300 glaciers. They have bats, migrating birds, a lot of cultural history, and all of these scientists were using this thing called GIS to understand their own field of study. I had no idea what GIS was, but I knew that I should learn it so that I could have a permanent job with the park. So luckily, serendipitously, my partner at the time was a student at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So I enrolled in the GIS certificate program there. And I met many of you who are on this meeting right now at that program, and it really changed my whole life trajectory. And I'm incredibly grateful for that because, as you all know, it's a very cartographic, historically cartographic school. So when I graduated with that certificate, I got a job here in Bellingham, Washington at a place called Cartographic, which makes a lot of maps for the National Park Service, green trails, Forest Service, etc. And I really enjoyed it, but I still wanted to learn a little bit more about cartography academically. So I went back to Western and got my Master's of Science in Geography, focusing on cartography. And that's when I really started to explore the more critical side of cartography, which I hadn't before, but it was that again sort of shaped how I think of maps today. And then upon graduating from there, I got a job in very late 2013 at Esri, which is where I am now. So this is just a quick slide to tell you what I do at Esri to explain my job a little bit. I'm a professional services cartographer, which means they have a professional services division, and I get to work on our customers' mapping projects. And like I said before, I'm also a product engineer for the Maps for Adobe Creative Cloud extension. And I'm part of, I'm a cartographer for the Esri Map magazine, which is upcoming. The name is even to be announced later on, but that's an exciting thing that's coming up. This is the picture of the website for the app I work on. I also, on my spare time, which is not very much lately, this is not the website. It's sarahbellmaps.com. Oh wait, no, wait, sorry. This is that website. So I write for Esri sometimes. Here's this URL at the top. You can find some of the blog posts I write. I usually write about how to make maps or how to leverage Maps for Adobe in your mapping workflows. And here's the one I thought I was showing you, my personal website, which needs a lot of work. But if you go there, you can find some more personal mapping that I do, including this font called Bell Topo Sans that I made for mapping, and you can download it for free and use it. And this is my final slide in my introduction, just to share that along with my personal website and Esri work, I just am obsessed with cartography and mapping. I do hand-drawn maps, which are the top two left. So the one on the top left, that's a color pencil hill shade that I drew of the North Cascades. And then the graphite one, that's of a mountain in Alaska. And on my website, you can find tutorials if you want to try doing some hand-drawn mapping yourself, specifically to hillshade. The lower left and the lower right are just showing you that when it comes to cartography, I take it all in, including the fonts that go on it. And sometimes I'm unable to find a font that I really want to fit my map. So I've been dabbling in a little bit of typeface creation. The middle one is a topographic map of rock climbing areas in Lexington, Kentucky, specifically the Red River Gorge. So I really get into the graphic design work of mapping. And then the upper right is a mobile version of I guess we call them scrolly telling maps now, that I developed with a friend named Jacob Wasilkowski, who's also Esri, very talented developer. And that was also a labor of love. We even had our friends do holistic testing to see how we could improve this map. But this was a map I really believed in and wanted to put out in the world, and also wanted to learn D3 a little better on mobile. So this is just showing the voting landscape in America in various aspects. I think right now it's showing gerrymandering, for example. So that's me. And I will hand it on to Daniel as soon as I stop sharing.
Excellent. All right. I will share my screen. There we go. I didn't prepare any slides. I'm not really a slide person. My name is Daniel Huffman, and I am a freelance cartographer. I do a little bit of freelance GIS, but mostly freelance cartography. And I live on the east side of Madison. I've been doing this for about 10 years, ever since I got my master's degree at the University of Wisconsin in cartography. And then I found myself unable to get a real job, and so I made my own. And if you're interested in kind of knowing what I do, you can visit my website, somethingaboutmaps.com. And I've got a portfolio there that has a selection of some of the pieces that I've worked on. And there's a pretty huge variety of styles and subject matter and sizes there, because it's whatever people want to hire me to do. So I've done plenty of, little black and white maps for people's books, go in their manuscripts, reports. I've done big terrain posters that go in like a government office on this island, for example. I've done entire 120 map atlases of ecological data. There's a little bit of everything there, and I appreciate kind of the variety that freelancing brings. When I'm not freelancing, I do a lot of teaching, both formally and informally. I adjunct from time to time at UW. Every couple of years, I teach an intro cartography class there. But I also do a lot of informal teaching. And on my website, there's a link to my YouTube page or to various tutorials or my blog, where you can kind of see me talk about what I'm working on and teach you how to do some of the things that I do. And that's really one of the things that's very important to me in my practice, because that's something that I've drawn a lot of value from the cartographic community. We're very sharing oriented. We're very non-proprietary people, which has surprised people I've talked to from outside the field. They'll say, well, Daniel, you figured out how to do this cool thing, right? Why don't you keep that to yourself so your competitors can't do it? And I'm like, well, that's not how we work. I've learned so much informally from other people, and I want to give back. And that's why I'm here. And that's why all of us are here, as part of that process in sharing this knowledge. And I'm going to be approaching things pretty much on the fly here today. I work best when I'm improvising, so I don't have anything prepared to share with you. It's pretty much going to be driven by your questions, and it's going to be a little bit interactive that way. So if there are things that you see in my portfolio, if you want to browse around there, that you're curious about how I made, or if you're curious about what it's like to live as a freelancer and be self-employed, even if you're not planning on doing that yourself, I usually get a lot of questions about what that's like. And if you really want to know, you can go to my blog, and I post all of my finances there and like how much money I make every year. I still got to update that for this year's, but see what I'm working on. You can see maps that I make about Blue Moon ice cream if you're really curious. So just a snapshot into a lot of what I'm thinking about and working on there. So be looking to your questions in the chat to, because I teach, so I've got a zillion things up here ready to just spew out at you in impromptu mini lectures and slides to show. But, that could take 20, 30 hours. So I'll let you kind of decide for me what kind of things you want to hear about. And I've taken up 3.5 minutes of my 5 minutes, and I don't know what else to say about myself. Do any of you three want to add anything useful that people should know about me? Okay, then we can move
Where do we
on.
start, Daniel? I've only known of you for 10 years. And been in class with you, well, not that long, because I haven't been in class in a long time. I don't know if you've actually taught, I don't know. I don't remember. I think you were my TA at one point, and I think we were classmates at one point. I think we might have both had the fedora streak going at the same time at one point. I think
So
we were
got one in
both
the
going
back.
for it. Yeah, I pulled this one out of the closet this afternoon thinking, oh wait, there's still a certain demographic at WLIA who doesn't recognize me without it. Anyway, no, I thought the intros were fantastic from all three of you, and I love the diversity of the mapping that I think the collective four of us have done, certainly in our own unique ways, on a personal level and through the work we've done. I think it's really neat. And generally, like, I don't know, playing the role of taskmaster, something like that, ringleader, circus clown. I don't know what role I really have today. We're generally following the schedule that I drafted up before, which is all right. If I would have given myself more time before this, I would have set up a couple of poll questions, but instead I'm going to be very sloppy about this and encourage you all to engage with us a little bit. I'm going to throw just a couple questions, and if you want to throw your responses in the chat, just so that we have a bit of a, maybe populist idea of where you're all coming from. The first question I have, feel free to just answer it with a yes, no, Coulter, you're confusing, any of the three are good. Answer me this question in the chat, folks. Have you had any intensive training with cartographic design? I'm thinking like a semester-long course, an Esri MOOC, massive open, basically an open course, or anything else that would have exposed you to cartographic design for longer than me going on a rant or something similar. All right, so I'm seeing a bunch of responses.
Now, quick, count those
Honestly,
up,
I
Coulter.
think, say that again?
Count those up real quick.
Real quick, they came in, they fired in fast. Early on, it looked like if it was a fairly even split. And then I think there was a decent tide towards yeses. And I have certain other comments like Christine Keller talking about watershades. So I'm guessing that was an intensive rant, Joe. And Christine's here to defend herself if that is the case or not. And one person who's, Joe says that the watershades talk was multi-semester. So I can only imagine what that was like. Inside joke there, I am guessing. Oh, wow. That's all right. Following more of that commentary in the chat. And I do see one reference to the Esri massive open course. So it seems like we have a decent amount of folks who are trained here. So that's, I mean, self-training matters too. I think a lot of us, I mean, I don't know that I would say my map sketching as a kid was cartographic design. I sincerely don't think it was. But you can do this stuff on your own a little bit too. I think another very reasonable kind of jumping point for a cartographer is to start learning graphic design stuff. And in my case, it's led to a bit of self-trained graphic design trickery that I would have never anticipated when I started doing maps what, as a college student 13 years ago already. But second question that I have, and this is the last one, do you feel you have time or can make time to practice cartographic design more than just kind of the defaults in your own work? Give me the same answer. Oh, first one, never. Oh, here we go. Here's the heartbreaking tide. I think we're seeing about 1 yes for every 9 no's. Oh, here's a strong heck no.
It's real
Make
strong
more
Wisconsin
colorful
language.
no's.
I was
It
going to
is a
say that's
very-
a strong
very
language for
strong-
Wisconsin.
It is. Carrie Morell gets the, oh, here's one person, good Shelley, who, oh my.
Okay, well,
Shelley
if
makes
you're
time for it, so good for her. And I mean that sincerely.
if
I
you
have
want,
cheese
I'll talk
dough
to
from-
all your bosses and tell them to give you time. All of us will talk to your bosses if you want to just pass us along, and we can tell them that it's valuable and important.
There you go. I do love cheese no coming from Joe Martell, who I think is reporting to us from Antigo. And over in Wauwatosa, we have Kim Meinert giving us her best grapes. No. So yeah, people don't have time to do this stuff. Like I will say in my case, I kind of just forced it to happen. And I don't think I've had problems at the Public Service Commission with it, but I definitely got a few wrinkled noses at my county job when we went back and forth on Coulter's ideas for county cartographic design back in the day. So, I mean, and I think that is kind of the big limiting factor for a lot of us. And I mean, I'm sure all of our speakers get it as well. It's just that there's a lot of great design ideas and there's a deadline, and it was probably yesterday. So like that's I think the thing that we have to balance a bit, and just something to keep in mind too. So that was my limited surveying of the crowd. We have until about 1:55 or 2 o'clock at the latest for a break. So I think we can take this one of two ways. We did receive a few questions and map samples back from our folks, from basically you all as conference or as workshop attendees. I've generally looked at the questions that have come in. Daniel, Lauren, and Sarah. I have not picked a favorite of my own that needs to be drilled into. Is there one of those questions that you particularly want to hit right now? Otherwise, we can probably organize this over the break. Daniel, you had a hand up.
Yeah, I'll jump in on one, but also I want to add something first to
Go for it.
to what you were saying and with the survey question, about formal education and informal. And people ask me a lot about, how do I get into cartography? Interested in changing careers or whatever. And one of the things I tell them is that probably 80% of what I know and do is all from informal learning. Going to conferences, going to sessions, like these kind of things, hearing workshops, just chatting with colleagues and saying, what did you figure out? How do you do this thing? The formal education where it's really valuable, I think, is pointing you in the right direction. Sorry, you can hear cats running around in the background, probably chasing each other. Also, there may be jet fighters overhead and loud trains passing 20 yards from my apartment, so just be ready. The formal education is nice because it gives you a structure that points you in the right direction to add on all that informal knowledge later. But that's really where it comes from. And fortunately, there are these kind of things like the Esri MOOC that kind of give you this online opportunity. And UW has plenty of online degree programs nowadays. But definitely, if you're learning informally, that's good enough. That's what most of us do. So but Coulter sent along the questions that some people submitted in advance, and the very first one on the list was something that kind of set my brain automatically down a little automatic education path, because I teach these things, and so somebody says something like, well, I have a little mini lecture. So there's a question that comes from Michelle at Dane County, which is the county in which I live. And Michelle is asking if we can tell what kinds of map legend titles we prefer to use. Whether or not, your legend says legend on top of it, or key, or explanation, or those kind of things. And when I was taking my intro cartography class when I was doing my grad school about 10 years ago, remember my advisor would say, never put legend or key on your map. Don't say those words. That's, people know what it is, and that just looks silly. But that perspective, I think it misses an important point in that not everyone understands what that means. There's map literacy, right? People aren't just born understanding how to interpret symbols on maps, and they need to know that if you have some red square somewhere, that they need to be told what that means. And this is the sort of thing we start to understand the patterns of how maps work as we're children usually, but different people are at different levels. And I don't think there's necessarily any harm in specifically helping people and saying, here's what's going on. This is a legend. In case you didn't know what a legend is, this is telling you what's going on. That being said, there are plenty of other alternatives if people don't like those kind of things. So let me just pull up here, do a little screen share. Yeah, so let me just pull this. So this is like an example legend that got attached as part of the question. Pretty standard stuff. But if you don't want to put legend there, oftentimes I see if I can find something like, I'll see if I can find something else that might be, see, I've just got all my slides here. Here's a map of land cover, and it says land cover right there on it. So it categorizes what these things are you're looking for. It even has the map title right there. So there's like a one-stop shop for everything. So you don't have to look around hunting for these other things. Or for example, here I've categorized, instead of saying legend, I'm actually saying, here's what these numbers mean. Instead of, the description of what's going on acts as the title. But I would take this farther and suggest that that a large percentage of maps that have legends don't necessarily need them. To me, they're like scale bars and north arrows, and that I think that kind of people assume you have to have them on a map by default. But I would encourage you to think about whether or not they're adding anything useful. I almost never put scales or north arrows on my maps, and I only put legends sometimes when there's something specific. Like without a legend, you're not going to know what these colors mean. There's no way to know. But sometimes there are ways to embed the legend in the content of the map. So for example, let me just pull up this piece here. Not that big, there we go. So this is a part of a map that I worked on for an atlas, and this is about some data about where snow crabs go in the waters off Alaska. And if I zoom in down here, I've got some information about these snow crabs. I've got some arrows. What do those arrows mean? Well, those arrows are where the adult females migrate. And the reader can tell that because those words are written there at the same angle as the arrows and in the middle of the arrow. And in the same color, because these outlines are gray and the words are gray. What are these yellow dots? Well, they're the possible nursery sites where scientists think that these crabs are breeding. I could have, a traditional way to think about it would be, well, why don't I take those yellow dots and put one somewhere in the corner of the map? Up here, for example, where I've got the indication what the levels of gray mean, I could put yellow dot equals possible nursery sites. But I would say, why make somebody look over there? I'd say that insofar as possible, when somebody is looking at something, tell them what they're looking at rather than making them go hunt around for it. And that's not always practical. Here I've got this legend that tells you what the trawl density is, basically when they're trawling the waters, how many snow crabs did they find, basically? Where do we think these things live in greater densities? And it wasn't really practical to find a way to label all the numbers on this thing in a way that wouldn't have been cluttered and messy. So here, I did shove that over to a legend, but a lot of the rest, everything's just written right there. And it's written in a text style that makes it obvious to the reader that what goes with what. This text is at the same angle as the arrow. This text is in the same color as the thing it's labeling. So it pairs up. So I'd say sort of think outside of the box with regards to legends, not just whether or not you need to put the word legend on there, but also whether or not you need that at all, or how you can organize your legend in a way where the words in your legend are sort of more efficiently telling people what's going on, because they don't, even if they've never heard of a legend before, they don't necessarily need to be told that word to derive the useful information. Like here, they just need to know what the colors mean. The colors mean the change in the median housing value between these years. So that's my little legend spiel slash rant. And I don't know if any of you want to chime in and add things. And also, as a side note, as we go on, we're going to be talking about lots of things. If you have questions that shape up because of that, please feel free to add them in. And also feel free to throw in your own opinions, everybody in the audience too, about how you treat these things, whether or not there's alternative approaches that you want us to talk about or that you do in your work. Feel free to interact with each other through these questions and answers.
Yeah, I think to add on to what Daniel said too, that's kind of at the Washington Post, that's kind of how we approach things too, is, what like little bits of text can you add to that key to help the reader just better understand what they're looking at? So having the title of the key almost act like a little like tiny map title can sometimes help, especially for, at least at the Post, sometimes we're tight on space. So we can't have like a headline and a big paragraph describing what's going on. And so just like having a little snippet of text that says like, this is what you're looking at, and then, a breakdown of colors and stuff can be helpful.
And I think ultimately a lot of this boils down to, knowing your likely readers of the map or your mapping app. In some cases, what are they going to expect? Like, what information do they need to know through a legend, or most importantly, through the map itself? Like in my cases, I let that guide what added text goes with a map layout, especially at the Public Service Commission, where things are a little more rigid, because I can't treat maps necessarily like they're an art when I need to be able to report on the status of a broadband grant project. I need to be able to say, here's where the applicant is going to offer internet service, and here are these other things. I don't want to waste a ton of map space because, okay, the artist in me says it looks ugly. But you do need to be aware that you're giving your end user what they need, and whether that, sometimes that is literally with LEGEND, sometimes it's with a very different technique. And I think being open to any and all of them, I think is the rule. I mean, should be the rule. And I think Daniel and Lauren hit that pretty darn well. So, Sarah, do you want to add anything? I think we've hit this hard, but you might have more.
Yeah, I shared a link of a map that I made with Maps4Adobe, where the words themselves are just indicating what they represent by their color of the words. But I want to go back to the idea that we have a deadline, so we can't focus on aesthetics. First of all, a map's message is the first thing I want to look at or listen to when I see a map. What is the person trying to say? But I know this is easier said than done. I totally realize this, having worked with customers. But sometimes I offer, perhaps it's your boss, if you want to convince them that spending time on the aesthetics is worthwhile, before and after, saying, this is what I can do with what you're asking me in the time frame. And if you give me a little bit more, this is what I could do. And then I want to also acknowledge that we have limitations with the technology that we're allowed to do our projects in. So in Illustrator, you can do all sorts of things, right? The world is pretty endless in the effects you can do. And it's not the case in every mapping program that you're doing. But there's still always a low-hanging fruit thing, like maybe your line widths are a little too thick. If you made them half the width, maybe it's just going to be a little bit more legible. Every map is not supposed to win a contest. It's supposed to convey the message to your audience. So I don't want you to get discouraged with all of these, no, I don't have time. Every map you make has an opportunity to kind of like just, convey it clearly. So yeah, I'm in those situations as well. They're not necessarily maps that I'm allowed to share with the public, but there's oftentimes limitations on the deadline or what I can do with the software. But there's always an opportunity in there to have some fun with the aesthetics. So I hope that's encouraging and not discouraging.
And I want to add something to that, unless Coulter, you want us to move
No,
to
go
a break
ahead.
immediately.
The thing I've got like breaks away a little bit. So I'd rather you get your stuff out, because I think we're also getting close to break transition time.
There's, a lot of you are in positions where the maps you're making can have some sort of public outreach component. you're producing something about, either, bike maps for the public to use, or, maps of city infrastructure, county infrastructure, things that you're trying to share with the public. Here's what we're doing in government. Here's where your tax money is going, things like that. And I think it's important to pay attention to the aesthetics of those a little bit, because it reflects a few different things back on the agency. One, you want to show people the place that they live and care about. You want to show that in a way that looks great. I've seen maps out there before that have come from agencies, and I've seen people reacting to them saying like, wow, they made my hometown look so unattractive. I don't feel respected. But also, um, I think it also means that your map gets more traction potentially. People can get really excited when they see a map of the place that they live and it looks really nice. And so maybe you didn't intend for it to go viral about, here's where the power lines are or whatever, but suddenly people are really excited about that subject and they're paying a lot more attention to what you're doing. And because the piece is also visually interesting to look at, they're much more willing to engage with it. So I think if you're trying to get some public outreach, paying attention to some of these aesthetic details pays you back in terms of that engagement. So I think that's an argument to take to the people who are kind of dictating your time, to say that this is, if our goal is to reach people, we're going to reach more people if you give me the time as the map creator to fine tune some of these details, or run it by my colleagues and get some feedback and make changes, or even show it to 5 or 10 people in the general public and see what do they want, what do they see here. So I think there's definitely an argument, especially in those kind of things.
Excellent. And yeah, this is what I'm saying, and I'm going to use this as a segue out into break. But I think the other thing that, again, I've been fortunate enough to kind of be able to will this into my work at the PSC is that a big thing that I've pushed is kind of boiling down a mapping template that by and large our office has followed really pretty closely over the last few years. Admittedly, it also means I've gotten a little complacent and haven't made changes in a while. But the fact that I was able to, as I was stacking up map projects generally around similar themes, it allowed me a process to basically have a working foundation of what the Public Service Commission's broadband maps were going to look like. And when it came time to make a new map, I usually wasn't working on big picture things because I had them at a place where everybody was seemingly happy with them. And then I could take time to work on more minute details. But that's a process that requires stepping back a bit and being able to put thought into both your short-term mapping game and your long-term mapping game, which I can't say everybody has time to do either. I mean, there was certainly a stage where I think my first year or two on the job, I was saying, well, we're just putting out mapping fires as they come. We're doing a bunch of reactionary stuff. And even now, it's not easy to be terribly proactive, just because there's a lot to be caught up on. And I think that's true for probably a lot of folks, especially on the government side of the house. Private sector can probably say this too, but I can't empathize with it as well just because I haven't been there. Besides in that freelancer sense from time to time. So it is 1:58. I have been glued to my chair since about noon and maybe earlier. So I'm thinking, and just looking at the schedule, it's probably a good time to do maybe a 5, maybe 7-minute break. If we can aim to be all back here at 2:05, we'll go ahead and get started again with Sarah's presentation tied to Maps for Adobe. So does that still sound good to all the presenters? 2 thumbs up and a nod. That's good enough for me. So let's take a few minutes here to take a break, stretch your legs, get something to drink, whatever you do, and we'll be back at 2:05. And we are back, and I've seen our first review for the break music come in. Apparently my coworker Milena thinks it is great. My slightly more tempered response is, I hear our break music and think of the fall meeting back in October because it's the same music, but it's good. Thanks, Milena.
Coulter, can I ask a question, please?
You may ask a question. I don't know if everybody's on the line yet, but you can give it a shot.
All right. I guess maybe I'll wait a second, but I'll say it anyway. That way, whoever comes on, comes on. Do you think that part of the map creation process is changing because we all have different audiences with our phone, like a smaller laptop screen, other handheld devices, you know, PC monitors, even vehicles? Do you think that, do you think our maps are required? You know, there's like a requirement to change them because people can't look all over those screens. You know what I mean? I'm trying to come up with other reasons why to modify the mapping process other than just the traditional ways. Thanks for the question.
No, I think it's a good question. What comes to mind, and I'm purely speaking from my at work perspective, which I think limits the scope a bit here, is that I think, it depends on your workspace and your intended kind of medium that you want to share that map over. Like at the Public Service Commission, there, especially for internal products, there's not a lot of call for it being super mobile friendly. So, internally, especially, so by and large, people are still largely using their PCs to look at mapping applications. And if we were in the office, they'd probably still be looking at paper just as much as they were looking at those mapping applications. I will say, when we do talk about breaking into more mobile friendly environments in our office, it's usually navigating a bit away from that mapping interface. And we've had a couple applications in the can where the GIS and the mapping stuff, which has been at the forefront for so long, takes a funky backseat, and all you're doing is typing in a query and getting a listing of results. But, a GIS server's running in the back and making all that geographic stuff happen. It's that the end user doesn't see it. We don't have much of that going out into production yet in our case, but thinking 10 years ago when I was interning at the Geographic, oh my goodness, it was, there were separate meetings to talk about having a magazine map ready for the iPad. I think when you're in different environments, you get very different responses to that question, Joe. If anybody wants to add anything to that. Basically, Joe was asking, if you didn't catch it when we were getting back on, and then we're going to turn it over to Sarah. If, part of the call for making maps more I think more adaptable is really tied to really that call to fit a bunch of different screens and a bunch of different mediums. And yeah, my response was basically kind of a depends on what your client's looking for type basis. In my case, I haven't had to do a ton of mobile development in my example. I don't know if anybody feels differently about it.
I certainly have made things for different sizes of screens, but it's very uncommon for anybody to ask me to make the same piece for multiple displays, I think. And usually if they do, I just sort of default toward making it small, and then it's probably going to go fine in print. And it's usually, it doesn't really require me to follow a different process than I've followed for anything in print. It's really just about making the text larger, making the map a little less cluttered, and making everything generalized to a little bit of a higher, more abstract level. But technology-wise, it's pretty much all the same, and I'm getting at the same kind of core concepts in the design.
Excellent. Sarah, Lauren, did you want to add anything, or else we can turn it over to Sarah?
I can just jump in real quick. Yeah. So at the Post, we're making a lot of stuff for a lot of different screen sizes. We're publishing digital primarily, and every so often things will run in print. Not everything, but maybe like 10% of the projects we work on. In terms of screen sizes, I feel like in terms of mapping, like the content's the same. We're trying to show the same data, show the same pattern. But when the screen size goes smaller, for the static map specifically, that just we like make different versions for different screens. When you go down to mobile, you just have to simplify down a little bit. So remove some of the labels. Realistically on a phone, if you put all the labels that are on the desktop size, you're not even going to see the map by the time like you're done with the label placement. And so it's kind of like a simplification down, but also having to try to, think about different sizes as you're creating something. And then for print, it depends on the size. Usually we take one of those different sizes and apply it to the print paper and update it for print colors and stuff. But if it goes bigger, then it sometimes has to be a recreated map. Sometimes if it's one of our interactive pieces, obviously we can't export out like a map box or ArcGIS online map and run it in the print paper. And so in those cases, it's building a completely different map.
So the situation varies wildly, which is healthy, I think, for all of us as mappers, but can lead to confusion too, but it depends on where your focus is. And speaking of focus, we're gonna turn things over to Sarah Bell, who's going to give us a pretty clear shot at maps for Adobe here for a little bit. Are you ready to go, Sarah?
Sure, yeah. Another interesting thing about mobile that we have to think about at Esri is people are using mobile oftentimes outdoors. So the lighting is different. The contrast has to account for sunlight, or are they reading it in their car at night while driving? It is a whole different ball game. But ultimately the map legibility is all the ultimate goal. Yeah, so I guess in the chat, instead of saying yes, you have heard of Maps for Adobe, say no if you haven't. I'm just curious. Maps for Adobe, it's ArcGIS, Maps for Adobe Creative Cloud is the full. No, okay, awesome. This is good. Woo, lots of no's. I'm gonna use that as an opportunity. I'm gonna also share my screen once I remember how to share screens. I share screens all day long, but when it's for a live demo, it gets a little, forget how to even talk. All right, so what can you see? Can you see a map that says Centrum Oslo? All right, I see a head nodding. Do you see ArcGIS Maps for Adobe Creative Cloud opening slide? Okay, awesome. Thank you, Coulter. All right, so I'm going to give you a demo of this software that some of you might have heard of and some of you definitely have not heard of. And I'll just move forward. So obviously some of you haven't heard about this before. So I'm going to give a brief description about what it is. I also want to acknowledge that there's going to be some questions, hopefully, and some of them I might not be able to get to. So I'm going to share a list of resources at the end of this demo along with my email address for follow-up questions because I want to make sure I answer everyone's questions. But what is Maps for Adobe? So Maps for Adobe is a map making plugin or extension, as they call them in the Adobe world, developed by Esri for use in Adobe Illustrator. You can also use it in Photoshop. We're currently, what you can download today is version 2.2, point whatever patch release. And this includes, this current version that you can download includes the new ArcGIS Pro integration. And I'll talk about that. I'll demo it a little bit. Coming soon in the next few months, we're going to have version 3.0, which will include ArcGIS Enterprise compatibility. And we're also hoping to get in some vector tile consumption compatibility with it as well. So that's exciting. I also want to announce that I'm wrapping up a book. This is going to be the official textbook for Maps for Adobe. We're hoping to have it out in publication and ready to buy sometime in spring, maybe early summer. But yeah, so keep an eye out for that. I wrote all the tutorials in the book so that hopefully the readers would be able to touch every little tool and aspect and window of the tool. So keep an eye out for that. This slide I had at the end, but while we were talking, I kind of put it in the beginning because I wanted to show this is just a few maps that I made with Maps for Adobe. a lot of the maps that I put out in public, they're more like this one in the lower right, kind of fun. Yeah, or this one in the upper left, not super complicated, but this one on the upper right is more of a topographic map. We just want to show you can make, full-fledged with woodland tint from the USGS and hillshade, and this one in the middle, also kind of mimicking a sort of National Park Service map style. So you can make more traditional looking maps. It's not just these fun ones that I kind of put out. And this one on the lower left that's cut off, that's a fantasy map. So all sorts of maps obviously can be made with it. So what is it? Let's get that working definition out there. So it's a tool. It allows graphic designers, you open it up in Illustrator, you can, and there's 3 different licenses. You can get a plus license, which is a minimal monthly fee for all the bells and whistles. You can get a free license, which gives you limited access to a lot of the tools. And then you can, if you have an ArcGIS creator, GIS professional, viewer, or editor license, you will be able to use it. You already have access to it. So you can, if you have Illustrator, just install it, and then you can use every tool available. But if you're a graphic designer, this is how we initially developed it. People who need to make maps, but don't necessarily need to learn all of GIS. They just need to make a map for a brochure, or perhaps like their local news agency needs a little inset map or something. So you can, it was designed to make graphic designers be able to still use a tool they're familiar with, a graphic editing program like Adobe Illustrator, and still get access to online content. Because of the Creative Cloud part of Adobe Creative Cloud, ArcGIS Online, we're able to connect it to ArcGIS Online. So it's also something that can unpackage now a map that you make in ArcGIS Pro. You basically export your map with ArcGIS Pro as an AIX file, which stands for Adobe Illustrator Exchange file. And then you can open it with Maps for Adobe installed and get a fully organized, ready to design file. So what I mean by organized is all of the layers, the layer organization that you have set up in your GIS and ArcGIS Pro, it is transferred to Adobe Illustrator. And it makes map design collaboration easier. So what I mean by this is, what I've learned is there are people who really love just doing the GIS analysis, and then they have these folks on staff who are the graphic designers. Well, you can share your AIX file or your online web map with your graphic designer, and they can open either one in Adobe Illustrator in this program they're used to, without having to conquer every tool in GIS and start designing the aesthetics of their map. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to show a quick demo of features for all of you who might not have seen it before. I'll show you the Adobe Illustrator Exchange workflow going from ArcGIS Pro to Illustrator. And I'll share some upcoming features and the useful links slide. So, alrighty. Now I'm going to bring up all your faces in case I miss like a chat or something. Nope. There you are. Alrighty. So here I am in Adobe Illustrator. And maybe in the chat, how many of you use or have access to or have used Adobe Illustrator? I can find the chat. Can't find the chat. Anyone want to chime in and say if anybody's saying yes or no? I don't know where the chat is.
It looks like it's a real
here we
mix.
go.
Yeah, it's
There you
all
go.
over the place.
Some. Okay, cool. Historically. All right, awesome. Well, Adobe Illustrator is this vector graphic editing program put out by Adobe. Same folks who make Photoshop, and the two programs actually go hand in hand really well. But when you install an extension in Adobe Illustrator, you'll find it here, Window, Extensions. I have this Font Self Maker extension installed, which makes me, it helps design typefaces and turn them into fonts. And then I have ArcGIS Maps for Adobe Creative Cloud. I've already signed in, hopefully. Yes, so I have this Oslo map board right here. And when you sign in, you'll get your ArcGIS Online sign-in page, or if you're a Plus user, you'll sign in that way. But I'm already signed in. So the first panel that you see when you open Maps for Adobe is what we call the Map Boards panel. And this is just basically a live web map. You can see it's tiles drawing. We're in Norway, but this is where you define the extent of your map. We call it a map board in Maps for Adobe, kind of to mimic sort of the art board in Adobe Illustrator. You can, let's say, go to Madison, Wisconsin, because let's say I wanted to do my map in Madison. So here we are in Madison. And now I know where I want to map, so I would draw my map board. So you click the draw tool. You can also import data and have the map board be defined by the extent of a particular data set. But I'm just going to freehand draw it. Roughly Madison. All of you Madison folks might be saying, that's not Madison. It's how I remember the extent of Madison roughly. And you give your map board some parameters. You can name it Madison, for example, and map. And then you also have all of these preset sizes. So this actually comes from Illustrator. When you start Illustrator, oftentimes you can define your map board or define your project just by a common print size, web size, whatever. I'm going to just keep it calculated, which that means it's just drawn manually. And it's a very tiny map right now. It's only 327 pixels wide. That is because it's at a 288 scale. So I can keep the map extent and just change the scale, and it's going to increase the size because of this wonderful mathematical triangle that is inescapable. You see the size changed because now I'm covering the same size, but I want to show more. I want to show the features as bigger. I increased the scale. You all know scale probably better than me, so I think that's all I need to spend on that part. But here we are. So we're zoomed into the map board. I've defined my area, and I'm ready to draw. Are ready to add data. So we go to the compilation panel, which is right here. There's many ways to get to the compilation panel, but I already have it open. Oops. And you can dock these panels just like any other panel in Illustrator. And now this is a what you see is what you get sort of static version. It's not web anymore. It is web, but it's not dynamic. So I'm zooming into a raster-based map, so it's going to get fuzzier and fuzzier. But now I can add content. Really quick, I'll talk about the different types of content you can add. You can add layers from ArcGIS Online, which is Esri's geospatial cloud-based platform or system. You can overwrite from a map, which means a web map. A lot of you are familiar with Esri web maps. It's a ArcGIS Online compilation of its own data. And this is really useful for if you, let's say you live in Madison and you're always making maps for a particular customer and it always needs the same data. You don't have to add one by one all of this data over and over again. So that can be useful. You can add places, which I'll do in a second, and you can add layers from a file. So you can add a CSV file, text file, shape file, KML or KMZ file from your local disk. So that's fun. And we also have these various base maps that you can add. You can do this vector street map. We will eventually be offering vector tile base maps, which will be awesome. And I'm just going to show you the ArcGIS Online adding experience. If you have an ArcGIS Online account, you are familiar with My Content, which is your specific content that you're hosting in your own ArcGIS Online account. You can find it all in your My Content section. My favorites are bookmarked. I'll actually add this one. Why not? U.S. Census tract areas. They're bookmarked data that you like to use over and over again. You'll notice most of mine, or a lot of mine, are U.S. or Washington State specific because it saves me from searching ArcGIS Online. Maps for Creative Cloud, a bunch of hosted data that we think is really optimal for this particular extension. Living Atlas of the World, which is Esri's thematic collection of valuable data across the globe, which is also where you can find this US tract area layer. and ArcGIS Online. So this is basically anything that's made public and searchable for this extension. I will be able to find it here. So I'm sure there's someone in this workshop who has ArcGIS Online hosted data that I could find this way if you made it public. Not everybody makes it public. So that's one, that's how you add data. There's another way you can add places. So I could search for an address. So I could say University of Wisconsin-Madison. I don't actually know the address. So hold on, sorry. University of Wisconsin-Madison, enter. All right, so I could add that. And it has added a point to the map right where it is. I can also just say, let's just do coffee for hospitals or whatever, schools. And it gives me 20 results. So in this search engine, it thinks there are 20 coffee shops within this extent. I can choose to add one by one. Or if you are a Plus or ArcGIS Online license user, you can add all of them. And there we go. We have all of the coffee shops that this thinks there are in this map. You can also access these change style, the ArcGIS Online styling tools, which is cool. So US tracked areas are interesting, but there's data attached to this. So why don't we give it a choropleth map? So right now it's saying show location only. And what that means is it's saying, show me whether it's there or not. So everything will get an identical symbology. I'm going to say, actually, show me the, you know what? I think I need to actually add the one that I thought I needed to add. Wait, for some reason it's not accessing the population attribute. So if you'll stand by, go to Living Alice and say US Census Tract. It looks to be the same. We'll just see if this one offers population. It does. Apparently it was a different data set. So I'm going to say population 2014 because that's the only population one available. And it gives me this automatic graduated symbology. I wanted it to do choropleth. So I'm going to click choropleth. And this is raw count. We're going to make it normalized. So I'm going to say population per square mile. And it gives me this natural breaks classification. I can access any of the different classification schemes if I want to. I'm actually going to give it more class breaks. I'm saying 7, but it's really 6 because you'll notice the lakes where nobody lives has, it's also a tracked area in this data. So I'm going to say the first category is 0 to 1, and that'll make all of the lakes have the same symbology. Another thing I want to do, actually, I want to cancel because you see this is 220,000. That's because that's the population density of something like probably Manhattan. So you can access a filter. We want all the counties that are called Dane. And not only that, we want all of the states that are called Wisconsin, which is abbreviated in this data set. And now it will smartly update the population density just for Dane County. So it should give me a better data classification. One thing that's interesting about live demos with software you're working on is you're on a you're on a daily build. So, so you discover bugs sometimes when you're giving your demo. Okay, so I want to divide it by, I said square mile. Remember, I gave it 7 classifications. So now it's only 61,971 per square mile. I'm going to change make them a little bit more meaningful. The class breaks, you can manually do them. And remember, I wanted this lower one to be just 0 to 1, so that's just the lakes. For the sake of time, I won't update the rest of them, but it comes with this transparency. If I were to download this map into Illustrator, the transparency would be transferred into Illustrator, which is really nice. I'm going to up the transparency so you can see it. And I added these coffee shops. I want to show you one more thing before I turn this into a map in Illustrator. We have this processes panel. So if you are, let me open up a file called Oslo symbols. If you design maps in Illustrator, you might be familiar with this thing called libraries, symbol libraries, brushes libraries, or swatch libraries. And what they are is they're these reusable pieces of artwork that you can create. So instead of recreating this pub symbol every single time, you can just open the file and drag it onto your map, for example, or any sort of artwork that you're working on. So we've automated the process. Instead of like dragging every single park symbol or every single bus stop symbol onto your map one by one, you can automatically replace the generic point symbols in our, let me go back to my Wisconsin map. Automatically replace these coffee symbols, for example, with that coffee symbol that I was showing you in my Illustrator library. So to do that, I just say run on sync, because you can also do it after the fact on your Illustrator file, like this one. Or you can do it while you're building the map with the extension. And so I need to point to that particular Illustrator library that I just showed you. And then I also would need to rename this layer so that the extension knows which symbols to replace. Rename it cafe. So now it's identical to the name in that library. So everything is set up. And then I would click sync. And instead of making you watch it sync for a minute, I have done this before the demo. And so here's what that would look like before I do any styling. So remember I said that these lakes in the data are actually not places where people live. So I've removed those lakes. And now I have in my layers panel, if I remove, let me find, there it is. Okay. So I have done nothing but remove those lakes. So what you get now, I'll remove this layer, is you get a nicely organized Illustrator file where your designer or you could grab everything in this category and suddenly change it at a a pattern all globally really quickly, instead of trying to search for every piece of artwork. And what I mean by that, for those who haven't used Illustrator, so there's only a handful of paths in this particular category. So it wouldn't be too challenging, but oftentimes there are hundreds of paths in a category. Well, now they're in a single layer. If you haven't used Illustrator, I'll just let you know that does save a lot of time. And you see I have this coffee symbol here where those generic point symbols were, and they were automatically added. And then one last thing I want to show you before we move on to ArcGIS Pro is this map legend tool. The map legend tool is something that will automatically take the symbology of any layer you have turned on and add a map legend. So I want to make a map legend for these Core Plus layers because, like Daniel was saying, oops, for some reason, you actually do need a legend for some things, because this blue doesn't necessarily mean anything to your map readers compared to this blue without a legend, or at least letting them know what sort of attribute you're trying to show. So with just these layers turned on, I could turn on this layer, for example, too, but it's going to know just make a map legend for these layers. So just click map legend. It's really quick. Oh, I have to click create legend. Took half a second. I have this legend right here now. It was pretty quick. We put it off the map because there's some sort of assumption that you might want to design it further and not have this default look. So you get all of the symbology, all of the numbers, and then you can kind of go to town with your own personal aesthetic. So do I have time for the ArcGIS Pro part of this?
I think you can do it.
All righty, here we go.
We can be free form.
Sure, it's kind of what we're doing. I'm gonna put my ArcGIS Pro map over here. So I know I'm talking to a group of people who are master GIS analysts. So this map is not meant to wow any of you, because I know you do tons of analysis. This is just a Core Plus map with a chart and then an inset map showing the population of certain areas in Spain, all of Spain, and then just Madrid. So I love Spain, so that's why I chose this map. And the idea here is if you're familiar with the ArcMap to Illustrator export, you get your map set up in ArcMap as you want, and then you would export it as Adobe Illustrator file. And now you can do that with Pro, only even more powerful because of Maps for Adobe. So all of your fancy GIS work, you get it done in Pro, and then you share it as a new file format called AIX. You can share a map or you can share a layout. I'm going to show you how to share a layout. The principles are nearly identical. And you might be wondering, well, now Pro has all of these wonderful design tools, but there are still a lot of people who are very tied to Adobe Illustrator. So we just wanted to make this available to them as well. You go to the file type, you choose AIX file, and you can choose whatever sort of parameters you want. If you add the color profile, that you embed the fonts, them, etc., the vector resolution DPI, and then you just export. After you're done exporting, you can open it up with Adobe Illustrator. I'm actually going to find out where I think I already opened it. Yeah, here we are. Cool. So I have done nothing to this, but share it as an AIX file and open it. And I opened it after signing into Maps for Adobe. So now you can see on the right, if you're a graphic designer or if you're someone who shares maps with graphic designers to edit further, we have this well-organized file here. So no longer is it a single flattened PDF file where you have to search for every little piece of artwork floating on its own. It's in its own discrete child layer or parent layer. And then, because it is with Maps for Adobe and it was made with ArcGIS Pro, the power of ArcGIS Online is still part of it. So I have these map boards that were automatically loaded because I have used ArcGIS Pro. So I have this Spain main map extent, and then I have the inset map. And those are automatically loaded from this inset extent and this main map extent. So it's kind of cool. I didn't have to define that at all. And what does that mean? Why is that so cool? I can see where my map is, but I can also add more data. So I can add, if I want to choose the Madrid inset, I go to the compilation panel. I don't know what layer to search for. Let's just say Madrid. And it's going to be searching, sorting by highest rated, which not always the most useful sort. Yeah, I'm just searching for all of ArcGIS Online. Let's say datos abiertos, open data, elementos de la red, elements of the network of the metro. So cool. So if I were to sync this to my map, it would automatically get added to that inset map. I'm going to actually give it a try. It's a little brave of me to do a sync in a live demo, because depending on the author, this might be extremely dense and complicated data, which can take quite a while. Okay, it's actually happening pretty quickly. So once that's done, it should be added to that particular area on my map and be, that's my own personal color settings, geographically referenced correctly in the inset map of my Illustrator file. You can see that the layers getting added on the right here to my Illustrator file. See the Illustrator going AWOL for a second. All right, while that's happening, any questions? This could be an Illustrator crash.
I myself don't have any questions, but I'm sitting here as someone who, both at work and out of work, who usually juggles between one GIS software program or another and Adobe. And I'm just thinking, oh my goodness, this is just such a a fun instance of the two worlds colliding, and what can I finally get myself around to go and do next. There is a question that came in: could ortho imagery be used as the map base?
Yes, yes, it can, especially if you have your own ortho imagery, or you can search for ortho imagery on ArcGIS Online. You can use it as your base for sure. And you can
Awesome.
reproject maps in Maps for Adobe. Sorry about this long syncing. This is because I chose some data that I should have tested before the demo. I was feeling brave, but yes. So if you reproject your map with Adobe Illustrator and then add it, then you would add your ortho imagery after the reprojection. If you use it with ArcGIS Pro, you can just export it directly as an AIX file, that layer. Good question. And I'm jealous that you get to work with ortho imagery.
So there's your mental note, Sally, on the ortho piece. Are there other questions out there, folks? And is there anything you wanted to add as well, Sarah, beyond where the syncing would have gone?
Yeah, where the syncing would have gone was this should add to your file. Apparently, and I've been on this metro, so, but it's a very complicated data set. It looks like there's 4 or 5 layers. But typically it would be quicker. And while somebody is, well, move on, this might just be taking a while, or it might have crashed Illustrator. But yeah, I don't have anything else to add, but I'm happy to answer any questions that you have.
Awesome. And thank you so much for that demo. Like, for me, it was definitely inspiring. Now it's a matter of, can I hit the brakes on my normal workflows and get some new ones in? Another call for questions, folks. Anybody?
And it does look like Illustrator did not like that. So
Okay.
of
Good
course.
to know.
This is Joe again. I always have questions, right? I mean, whether I type them or talk them. What is the intended audience for that? Like, I don't know about everybody else. There's 60 whatever people on here. Like the county I work for is very small, so I can't picture ever using it for that just because of the cost. For my own stuff, I would like to, but you know, for the county stuff, it's a no-go. But I guess I was just curious to what the intended use / audience was. Was it graphics designers, people like you were talking about earlier, or what was kind of the thought process behind the creation of this whole series of work?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the initial audience, we really were talking with a lot of graphic designers. We would go to Adobe events and talk with people there. It was really exciting. But we also, to speak back to the ArcMap to Illustrator export, it's a workflow that a lot of cartographers use. It's how I was trained at University of Wisconsin-Madison. It's how the National Park Service was doing it when I was making maps for them, the Forest Service, Green Trails. And ArcMap is a program, well, ArcGIS Pro is the one that we're growing and developing at Esri, and it's becoming really powerful. And so a lot of professional cartographers need a way to consume their ArcGIS Pro map in Adobe Illustrator. And that's enough. So cartographers are another one of our audience. And then we have this idea of collaboration where, so you work for a county, and Joe, do you do GIS, a lot of GIS? Is that what you do?
Yeah, that's where there's a difference, right? You do GIS for work, but you know, I'm a cartographer, right? So I would prefer to do cartography where I would, you know, I love all this stuff, but normally I don't get the chance to use tools like that. So
yeah, so if you have Adobe Illustrator or Adobe Creative Cloud, it's a monthly fee for this tool. I don't want to say an actual price because I don't know how much it is, but I think it's like the price of 2 cups of coffee a month. So, and you get a lot of access to a lot of the tools. And then again, if you are already an ArcGIS online user, you have access to this already. You just would need Adobe Creative Cloud. So yeah, our audience, I mean, I would like every mapper to give it a try. So in my world, it's every mapper who wants to give it a try. But yeah, we are trying to actually serve the requests of graphic designers and cartographers. So it's yeah, and the collaboration side with the GIS and their graphic designers.
I love it. Can you earlier you said you couldn't read the chat box, correct?
I can read it now.
Oh, you can read it now because somebody else has a added comment to mine, which I think is pretty much the gist of it.
And I can jump in a little bit on that in part because I've leveraged it a bit both at the PSC, and I finally bit the bullet and bought licenses for myself in my personal mapping side. Like the Adobe Creative Cloud, which has been on a monthly subscription basis for a few years now. I think it costs about $50 a month. And I think if you're a government entity buying licenses, that's mentally how we looked at that as well. And I don't, not to like poo-poo and say government entity this should be able to go ahead and buy the software, but just kind of being aware of how much our ArcGIS desktop licenses cost at the state level. And I mean, we're on the same master purchase agreement at the county level. The annual cost of an Adobe Creative Cloud is a few $100s, which is a fraction usually of our desktop software. So it depends on your entity, and I can't say I understand everybody's budget either, but Adobe's not usually the biggest financial hurdle to get over is what I'm saying.
If I could,
So,
go ahead.
That is a very, I totally respect that question that Andy asked. Why just do that in the GIS area? And I can speak to ArcGIS Pro that it is a very wonderful tool for designing maps and map aesthetics. And there's a lot of wonderful tutorials out there for that. There are just a lot of people who love graphic editing programs, or there's a lot of folks who are the GIS person who don't want the responsibility of bringing the aesthetic to the map, so they share it with their graphic designer. And that is really common, which I was surprised to find out. I learned that while at Esri and working on this tool. There's a lot of organizations and agencies out there that hire graphic designers to make these public maps look I don't know, marketable or whatever they want to say. And then Austin asked about labels. Yes, they come over. Not only do they come over, but they come over as their own string. So an entire label will be on its own editable string. You won't get every letter individually on a separate string. And that means something to people who have experienced ArcMap exports in the past. You'll have the word Madison. If you want to change the font, if imagine every word being on a different string. So it just would change the entire look of the word, but now they're all concatenated into one single label. Good question. Yeah, so it was a short presentation of a very complicated tool. So please do ask questions, and I'll share my email too. I guess I stopped sharing, but I'll share my email. Any open source programs that can work like this. I guess we'll ask Daniel. Maybe he knows.
So I want to loop in a question that was asked before the workshop too, that this all ties into, because it's a little bit bigger picture. So Sam at Northeast Wisconsin Technical College is asking about what programs do all of us use for maps outside of GIS. So you're talking about, ArcMap, ArcOnline, ArcPro are getting better and better, creating good maps. However, in order to elevate your maps to the next level, what are things like Photoshop and Illustrator used? And this is something that Sarah is getting into, but I think sort of the bigger question is, why is that? And what do these bring that GIS doesn't? And I think it's really about, it was once put to me that you could accomplish pretty much everything in Arc that you could accomplish in Illustrator. And I think that's true, although it tends to be a much more laborious process graphically sometimes to trick it into doing what you want. It's really about what these programs are designed for. ArcMap was never originated, and ArcPro never originated with the specific goal of saying, well, we're going to give you all the tools to do, the latest graphics polish on things. And so Illustrator and Photoshop and these kind of graphic design programs were created to make it easy to do those kind of things. But you can stay entirely within an Arc environment. And Arc Pro is getting more and more graphics tools that are being brought in that are basically inspired by what can be done in Photoshop, what can be done in Illustrator, and they're porting some of those concepts over into Arc Pro. And people like John Nelson have done a lot of tutorials about how to hack Arc Pro to get these cool styles going. And yeah, on the QGIS side too, there are a lot of people who have created some pretty impressive styles using the graphics generator in QGIS. So I don't think, I don't think it's this, either or kind of thing. It's a lot of us have been trained in this, like, well, I just do GIS and GIS, and then I get out as soon as possible once all my shapes are in the right place, and I just do my Illustrator work to make it look nice. But that's because it's just faster for me to use these tools. It's more efficient if I want to change my colors, if I want to develop these schemes, if I want to add these shadows, etc., things that are important to my work. But you can definitely get these things open, get these things working in GIS. But I think to go to Sam's question, for a lot of people, Photoshop, Illustrator, other graphic design programs, including free alternatives like GIMP, which is sort of free Photoshop, Inkscape, which is free Illustrator, basically. They can be a little clunkier, but they'll get a lot of the same job done. And just in the same way, if you're familiar with QGIS versus ArcMap, you can get the same job done in QGIS, although you may have to kind of relearn things and occasionally work around interesting roadblocks that you've run into because something crashed that day or whatever. So I think that's kind of an important contextual item to think about this, and why these programs have filtered into a lot of people's workflows, but why you can still do a good job without them.
Yeah. Thanks, Daniel. So yeah, here's that list of resources and my email address that I promised, and I can now, if you wanted that, here it is, and I'll stop sharing. All right.
Fabulous. Thank you for the presentation, Sarah. Oh, there's another comment coming from Carrie as well. I'll just read it. I'll read it aloud, I should say. Being from a county as well, but creating maps for other offices that do depend on aesthetics. I can see this being useful for those offices that have graphic designers, so they can now take the map a step further for publication. I mean, and even speaking from my side, to me, I think this is another tool that, I mean, Sarah, you pointed at the ArcMap, ArcGIS workflow, which you and I went through the same program. It's what I've known since 2007. And I still work within that workflow now for most of my projects one way or another. And I think this helps the flow of things, adds another option to make this more efficient. And I mean, I think it's going to allow me to do, a little bit of GIS work on that design side, so I don't have to hop between exports and stuff like that nearly as much as I have in the past, which I think will ultimately be really useful and a bit of a time saver. So, any last questions? Otherwise, we're actually probably approaching another break time pretty quick.
And we've got several still lined up from before. Do we want to tackle one of those?
If you have it in front of you and ready to go, Daniel, I say go ahead.
Sure. Let me just scroll down here through the list. So let me copy this link. A couple people also sent in maps that they wanted some feedback on. So this one comes from Christine at WizDot. And there are a few questions associated with this, and to avoid, sort of spending too much time, I'm just going to pick one of these things here. So the question is, the focus is the state of Wisconsin, but there is a need to have surrounding areas shown. Any suggestions to helping keep the focus on Wisconsin? So do you want me to answer? Or do you want me to turn it over to all of you?
And I'm pulling that link up
on
my
give you a
screens
second
as
to
well.
pull this up.
Yep.
For everybody to grab that.
I think I briefly looked at these yesterday and got a quick thought on it. but now that I'm looking at this one in particular and don't have, I think it also, hold on before I talk in any more half sentences. I'm going to pull Christine's question up as well.
Mhm.
And Christine, are you able to unmute yourself?
Yes,
I'm going to guess that's a no. We were chatting. Oh, cool. I will say when I saw the focus is the state of Wisconsin, but there's a need to have surrounding areas shown. Your ultimate question, any suggestions to keep the focus on Wisconsin? When I first saw that and looked at the links, I think there was one map that like didn't actually zoom in on Wisconsin, and it may have just been an initial extent issue. But I'm wondering if literally that initial extent is what you were thinking of, or if you're meaning where Wisconsin, say, sits in the visual hierarchy or something different altogether.
We've just been talking about this. So DOT within our team, I'm in our IT department and I work on a core services team. So we manage all of our enterprise data and services for the entire agency. And this base map is the only map that my team gets to create. So all the other DOT maps that are sort of out there for public use are really designed by the business areas that maintain that data. But the base map is commonly used for the interactive applications that the data sits on top of. And so this is something that even before I got to DOT, we were publishing these base maps for agency use. And, you know, there's been some comments back and forth internally within the agency. Do we need to see the surrounding states? Yes, we do. But then it sort of takes the focus off the state of Wisconsin, right? When you zoom way out, you see more of the Midwest. You know, so my thoughts would be to maybe tone down the outward states and highlight Wisconsin more, or switch the extent a little bit and maybe not show so much of the other states. But I mean, there was other questions in that email. We don't have to focus on this one. I think I have other questions about what we could be, you know, doing better in terms of this map in general. The legend comes to mind. How we do the labeling dynamically to appear over the map features, because that can be problematic if we have the labeling designed into the base map. Some of it gets covered up when data starts to be populated on top of it. So we're just looking for general feedback about this, and appreciate that you would take the time to look at it, because we certainly take a lot of time putting these base maps together.
I did pick out that question partly because I thought that it would lead into something that Coulter mentioned, which is visual hierarchy, which is this nice broadly applicable principle in cartography that kind of applies to almost any map situation that people can get a lot from. And so maybe it'd be good to talk about that. I don't know if we want to maybe take a break first and then come back and chat about visual hierarchy for a minute and how that applies here and in other places.
I think that sounds fine, but just to double check, Lauren, how long do you think your segment will be? I don't want to eat too much of that time up.
Yeah, so I have planned for 25 minutes, but I can also speed through a few things as well, so I can adjust as needed, because I think this is a really important topic. I think these are really good questions, and this is a really nice base map too. I'd love to talk about it more.
I think it's pretty darn sharp as well. And I think, I mean, with 25 minutes, I think we're pretty safe there. I would say it's 2:59 now. Let's go ahead and try to reconvene again at 3:05. And Christine, if you can stay on the line for a second, I can throw an idea that I have for my mapping past at you and see if it's something you want to play with. But otherwise, let's get back and hit visual hierarchy at 3:05. And we'll have Lauren take the floor after that.
Sounds great. Thank you.
Awesome. So Christine, you're still there, right?
Yeah.
One thing that popped to mind as you were talking about the whole out-of-state thing, when I worked for the county in Missouri back in the day, they were these folks who loved depicting their county as an island, which I absolutely hated, and forced had a little bit of a back and forth about how to deal with that. And I guess I'm going to find out now because I'm on their mapping app that I haven't updated myself in 7 years. And of course, they've moved on a couple of applications. Oh, pity. They went back to the island again. Well, boo them. I'm going to go back to my slideshow, and I think I've got a screen cap in there that shows what I did. So this map up here in the upper left-hand corner is St. Charles County, Missouri, and it's Flash application as I had it back in the day. And I basically insisted, you're right outside of St. Louis, people. St. Charles County doesn't matter without St. Louis, let's be honest. Okay, I was probably not quite so blunt. I didn't think the island was appropriate. I thought ultimately I included the road network within the neighboring counties because it's the road network that probably would actually matter to someone living within St. Charles County more so than having a fine level of detail. The other thought that popped in my head that might be useful is instead of doing the whole state and municipality thematic scheme almost that you have for all of the surrounding, well, I guess most of the Eastern Midwest, maybe another approach is to set like a 100-mile buffer or something that basically grabs the context that you think that the DOT thinks matters, because Cairo, Illinois probably doesn't mean anything to the Wisconsin DOT, where Chicago, Illinois obviously has some significance. So maybe cutting a 100-mile buffer around Wisconsin and then otherwise keeping your muted scheme here, maybe that's something to play with. And then you don't have to, I mean, I don't know. I should be on top of tiling technology better, but maybe then you're also not building tiles for whole other states. That probably isn't a tile set, but anyway.
When you say the Eastern Midwest, is there a Western Midwest? What would that be?
I mean, the Dakotas and Nebraska and Kansas.
Those aren't in the Midwest. Those are in the
Yes,
plains.
Colder.
Uh-oh. Who's that?
Colder.
I hear
It's
it.
Tony.
We're going to have a throwdown, also from DOT. Tony, come into the ring.
Right. So I actually created these maps. So
Oh,
the
nice.
but the so the caching level only is pretty much in the state of Wisconsin. The
Okay.
tiles there of the Midwest, we don't go too far down into the scales to make sure that we're not generating cache maps that are
That you don't
terabytes
need.
in size.
Right. Yeah.
So
No,
I think we use a buffer around the edge, and actually Adam Feit from DOT created these original maps, and I'm basically just being the caretaker of them at this point.
Okay. I think I found the edge. The world drops off somewhere south of Rockford.
Did you see the edge? Yes.
Oh,
Tony and Christine. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Coulter.
no, go ahead. Go ahead.
I was gonna say I second Lauren. I think as far as base maps go, this is one of the better ones that I've seen. I am playing around with it and noticed that in vector tile base maps now you are able to bring labels above your operational data. And I don't think I'm not able to do that in my experience with this web map, but maybe you can. Or maybe there's other, maybe I'm just not seeing the right base map. But that's one thing I would change. As far as the focus goes, I agree with Coulter that making your particular area of interest into an island because it's of your particular focus is, contextual data matters, even if it's not your geography. It matters that, especially if you're driving back home from the east side of Minneapolis to Madison, Wisconsin, it's important to see Minnesota. You know, this is a Department of Transportation map, and the roads don't just stop at the border of Wisconsin. And having said that, I might even have a couple highways in the surrounding states, maybe not Ohio and Indiana, but even have them appear at a little bit smaller scale, because weather doesn't stop at the, I'm sure weather impacts Department of Transportation a lot. All of the equipment that you have, and weather doesn't stop, roads don't stop. So I don't think it needs to be more focused on Wisconsin. I think this is very clearly about Wisconsin. And I actually think it's a really good map. So.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I think there's some context that needs to be had with the map, especially most of our data is Wisconsin centric. So when they're creating maps and apps with this particular cached base map, it is important to see that. The only problem we have sometimes is that, you know, it does drop off the face of the earth at the Minnesota border there, and it can look not so appealing in an app to do that. But also we're trying to limit extents too, so people can't get out that far either. So they're not able to get out past the border of Minnesota.
And I guess another place where and I mean, you'll understand the balance of this, you, Tony, and Christine, and the rest of the DOT team is you know, to the extent that there's any interstate cooperation or the need for out-of-state knowledge when it comes to planning projects. I mean, much like there is a fierce football rivalry between Marinette and Menominee high schools on the Wisconsin-Michigan line, it is a big deal from what I've heard. I imagine, you know, to a certain extent, you need a certain amount of data for whatever interstate planning. I mean, I don't know, you know what there is for interstate planning more than I would, but I assume you need to, it'd be helpful to know some Menominee, Michigan stuff. I don't know, when planning something out for the next US 41 project, but what you all need for that obviously is up to all of you. But another reason I think to vouch for at least a little context, but I do think this is pretty close already.
And I would suggest sort of carrying forward some ideas that you're already articulating here. Christine mentioned this idea of maybe toning back things that are not in Wisconsin, and there's already some of that going on. You know, if you look, sorry, are you screen sharing, Coulter? Can you zoom in on the Twin Cities?
Going back to the Twin Cities.
Yeah. And just, you know, you can see that, for example, the data start to get grayed out there. So it's the same roads and they connect into Wisconsin, and you can see that, but now their visual prominence is toned down. And I would say it's carrying that through for everything else that happens to fall in Minnesota, and choking back the water a little bit, making the land more subdued as well. And then you still have all this information that's there, and it's still clear that Wisconsin doesn't exist in a vacuum, but it also doesn't draw as much attention because that's not really where you usually want people to be looking, so that when they have the zoomed out version, they just see the shape of Wisconsin popping out in these bright colors. So I guess maybe we can use that as a segue into visual hierarchy stuff, because it's 3:09. So is everybody officially back, since we basically talked through the break with some of us?
Sounds like a map geek thing to do. I'm okay with that.
Oh,
Yeah, I would say, we've probably already tackled a little bit of the hierarchy piece, but I would say whoever's ready to fire off with more content, go, and then we'll switch over to Lauren.
So this is like a thing that I like to talk about, because I've realized as I go on in my career, it's basically one of the key elements in cartographic design. That I think organizes almost everything else. And so, these things that you're doing here, they make sense. And the reason I like to talk about visual hierarchies, it's really about bringing an organized way of thinking about these things so that you always know how to, make these decisions about, well, I'm going to tone back these colors. I'm going to make these things gray. And it's sort of understanding the rationale mentally behind why you think that's a good idea. And the basic idea is that between visual hierarchy is just that certain things draw our attention visually more, and certain things draw our attention less. And we want to organize our information along the same line so that the things that are more important draw more attention and other things draw less. So I have an interactive example. If you can hand the screen over here.
I will drop my screen share.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Take it away. Let's
see here. So I'm going to show a map for just a second. And it's just going to be up for a few seconds, but I want you to, and then I'm going to take it away, but I want you to just type in the chat, what is the first thing that you see, or the first set of features or colors or whatever that you see on the map? All right, so that was about 5 seconds. I'll pull up the chat here. And that was from a government organization in a municipal organization in Oregon, showing about, community amenities. So this is the kind of thing that the kinds of maps that some of you and your agencies might be interested. So I'm just going to browse here. Got some red stuff that's really popping out, yellow dots, red text boxes specifically, purple hospitals, places, red blocks. Yeah, so there's a lot of red, right? The red stuff, the red and the yellow stuff is the important stuff. So I'm just going to bring this back here so we can talk about this. Right, it's a really bright, bold, saturated color that draws our attention because these are some of the specific amenities that they wanted people to know about. And the yellow, this is actually printed with this, you can't see it on screen, but the original map is printed with this actually fluorescent yellow ink that's a little eye-searing, I think, but it really, these things draw your attention. The yellow is the routes that they suggest maybe you walk around to get to these red places. Nobody mentioned, however, the churches here, right? Here's some churches, because those are much more in the background. And so that's kind of the visual hierarchy at play here. There are things that pop out, and there are things that are sort of medium level, and there are things that are in the background, but they're all important. And the challenge that we usually face is that we think, well, I want people to notice everything on my map, right? I put all this data on here. People have to see it all. But the hard truth we have to accept is that people have a limited visual bandwidth. There's only so much we can absorb. We need to have this information fed to us a piece at a time. So we have to say, I want you to look here first. Now I want you to look here. Now I want you to look here. And we have to make this prioritization. And when we don't, things can get kind of muddled and messy. So this is taken from a report, mandatory filings regarding a proposed wind project. And there's all kinds of important information on here. Where the homes are, where the project site is, what the estimated noise levels that the wind turbines are going to generate. And there's some ortho photo there so you can see where the agricultural areas are, et cetera. And so all of this is important information for considering the context of the project. But it's all shouting at me at once. Right? As a reader, everything is fighting for my attention. I don't know where to look. And so this is what happens when there's really no attention paid to that hierarchy. So I think that oftentimes for me is the key difference between a map that's really successful and one that's not getting through to its readers as much is this attention paid to making sure that you lead people through this information piece by piece and being willing to tone stuff back and not to let it go away. I mean, in the DOT map, you could still tell there are roads going on through the Twin Cities, and you could figure that out if you needed to. It's just that's not where we want you to look first. So that's the big thing. And this is a sort of, this is software independent. You can do this with any program. And this is one of the sort of core cartographic principles that runs through any kind of design you want to make and through any software. It's just about thinking through those color schemes and the symbologies. And really the key things that draw attention are things that are bigger draw more attention, things that are more saturated, sort of bold, bright colors tend to draw more attention, and high contrast, things that look a lot different than their surroundings. So if you have a bright spot on a dark background or a dark spot on a light background, those are the things that draw attention. And so, maybe just thinking about how what you're willing to shove into the background can really turn your map from something like that, you know, into more of something like this, where it's all there, but now it's not overwhelming. So that's my kind of quick spiel about visual hierarchy. I'm seeing there's some things going on here. To me, the red and the green stand out, says CC, but how do you adapt your maps for people that have red-green color blindness? So that's a whole good thing to talk about. And I don't know, I don't know if this is going to work on my screen share because this does a little overlay. Did that change all the colors on my screen on the video? Okay, good. When I do those kind of designs, I use a tool called Color Oracle, which is really handy. It just changes your screen to look at, like, this is what it's going to look like for protanopes and tritanopes, etc. And the real thing, I think, is that people kind of absorb this concept of, you know, be wary of red-green color blindness. And that's important. I think it's important for all maps to consider that from an accessibility perspective. But it doesn't mean you can't have red and green at the same time. It's really just, you know, people who have trouble distinguishing red and green or other hues, they can generally tell differences in brightness apart. So think about organizing your information in a monochromatic way, thinking about, like, certain things are going to be dark, certain things are going to be medium, certain things are going to be bright. And then you don't have to worry about any of that. And that also plays in with the visual hierarchy too. Oftentimes, you know, maybe these bright things are drawing the attention first and so on, and then you go down and some of the other darker background things don't. But it's definitely a good thing to ask about and to keep in mind. But it's, you know, you can see, get this red for Bagley Park, green for trees and parks, parks over here. But, you know, that red is darker. So no one's going to have a problem with it from a color blindness perspective, even if they were completely grayscale vision, which is exceedingly rare. It still works just fine. So don't feel like you're limited in that way. Definitely. And Milena says making two different maps might help. And, you know, for when you have a lot of crowding, like you know, here on this thing, yeah, maybe sometimes the answer is don't put it all in one map. There is a lot of pressure sometimes, like, let's see how I've got all this complicated story. And the thing to understand is you're an expert sometimes on the thing you're making. And you can look at this map and figure out, oh, I need to know this about the houses and this about, you know, where the wind turbines are going. But sometimes your audience isn't as familiar. They don't know where to look. And sometimes separating it out is you know, part of the solution. When I was working on a lot of the maps in this atlas, the ecological atlas of the Bering, Chukchi, and Beaufort Seas, which is all about this huge amount of ecological data around Alaska. Some of the maps got pretty complicated. And at certain points we said, you know what, let's, you know, I don't have examples specifically in the portfolio, but this is probably about as complicated as they got. Sometimes we had more data and we said, you know what, let's just make that into 2 maps or 3 maps. That's a lot easier to ask people to sort through. And then it's even sort of a more literal linear reading. Because I was talking about visual hierarchy. If certain things pop out and read those first, well, if you have 3 maps in a row, you're literally saying, okay, assuming a certain reading order of like left to right or top to bottom, start here, read this thing. Now you understand that, now read this thing. And so you can start to get into this storytelling aspect that happens, you know, and it happens in news stories and things like that. Sometimes they'll build the data set up in front of you and the pieces of that and just have each layer come in one at a time. So yeah, that's my little visual hierarchy spiel, and I'm going to stop monopolizing the time, and other people can say things too.
I just want to throw in there very specifically in the map gallery for this year, in the story map component or story map entries, the Manitowoc County planning application has a series of maps, kind of like how Daniel described, where it's a bunch of very similar base maps of Manitowoc County that jump between themes, and you, thankfully, because good story map UI, user interface development, you can jump from one theme to the next really easily, really slick. Hopefully I'm complimenting the cartographer's work who's on here somewhere. I don't know if Nicole's on here or not, but it was a really good example of splitting out multiple data sets over a really similar map setup. So Laurel sends me a reminder that it's about time that we get into Lauren's talk, and I think it is too. So if there's more, certainly throw it in the chat box. Maybe we can get to it. But Lauren, let's take the wheel.
Awesome, sounds good. And as I get set up here, what's a good stop time for me, just so we catch up with the other points, just so I can keep track as
I mean, at this point, I mean, if we have a few minutes to do outros, I mean, and by that I mean 3:55. My memory is failing me, plus I'm focusing on the workshop, so I don't know that there's actually anywhere that we need to go after 4 o'clock. There may be places where you or the rest of us need to go, but oh, somebody did now. I don't know if that's an actual happy hour commentary. So we've got a little bit of time to run over at the end, but I'd say 3:55 is kind of the drop time.
Okay, perfect. I'll be done well before then, but I just wanted
Okay.
to leave time for questions and whatnot at the end. So I'll go for a little bit after doing the East Coast. So a little bit after 3:30 is what you guys are at. So
Sounds good.
perfect. Okay, so I think everyone can see my screen. I think I have the chat up, and so but as I talk, please feel free to ask questions, and we can try to fit them in after my talk. But again, so my name is Lauren Tierney. I'm a graphics editor and cartographer at the Washington Post, and so for the next few minutes, I'm just going to go over kind of our process for how we make maps at the Post. Just anywhere from like our locator maps that we have to get out with breaking news, anywhere from like our big long-term projects. So just kind of our process, what software we use, and I'm also going to try and touch on some of the cartographic elements that we've discussed already today. Okay. So the Washington Post. So the Washington Post, our focus, particularly for the graphics department, and that's what I'm going to be speaking to, and for making maps at the Post is, we are responding to the news cycle, and we are trying to visualize things that are tying to what's going on in the news for the Washington, D.C. area, for the U.S., and also around the world. And so when we're responding to news, this means we work on a lot of different things. These are just a couple examples from this last year, which was full of a lot of different news events, particularly surrounding the pandemic, particularly surrounding the riot that happened last month. But we have to respond to a lot of different things. And sometimes that response time to making a map for something, that is something where we need to put on a dot on a map, and that's something that's made in an hour. And other times we're trying to break apart the news events and analyze it to look at, okay, what's happening, what data can we pull in to expand this news story and help our readers understand more of the complexities of what's going on. And so to break this down, the way we can break down mapping in the news at the Washington Post is essentially I've broken it down into 3 different phases. And all 3 of these phases, it depends on how much time you have and what is the most important thing to be included with the time frame you have and the deadline you have. So our phase 1 map for working for the Post is, where did it happen? I'm going to use coronavirus examples. These maps are about a year old, but this is an example that shows this kind of like elevation as a news event unfolds. So our quickest timeline or quickest deadline maps are where did it happen? And so for this example, it's often just a simple locator that's maybe 1 or 2 columns in size. And by that, I just mean that that's the amount of space it would take up in the print paper, but online, a 1-column map is maybe something that sits on the side next to the text, and the 2-column map would sit essentially in line with the text in an article. And so this is that example of phase 1 where we just want to tell readers, where did something happen? Where is this place? Where did the event take place in relation to a city, a state, a region, a country, etc. And so a map like this was probably made in about 30 minutes to tops an hour. So sometimes that's using template maps used in past stories. Other times it's making a map from scratch. A lot of the people on our team use QGIS just because a lot of people have worked in places previously that did not have access to ArcGIS licenses. And so some people use QGIS, some people use ArcGIS, but oftentimes this stuff starts in GIS software. So this is an example of our quickest turnaround map, 30 minutes to an hour. Use our template colors for land, for ocean, for our fonts, and then get it into the story as soon as possible. Our second phase of mapping for the news is what happened or what is happening. And so oftentimes this is a map that's an expansion of that first map. So we already have the geography of the first map for where something happened, but now we want to add data. So this might be something that we turn around in a day, maybe a couple days once we find data, depending on how easily accessible it is. And so this is a step up from that immediate locator map of where something is. And so in this phase, which is again like a 1 day to a couple day turnaround, we are still showing where something is happening, but we're also showing what is happening. So in this example, we have a bit more, we have thematic data added to it. We have data by province. We have some of these areas labeled. I don't have the key, unfortunately, or the map legend in this screenshot, but this would also include a map key that would say, you know, what these data points are, what the different size of the dots mean. And then also sometimes this means making another map to show what else is going on that's accompanying a story. In this case, you know, another map was added to the story to show how cases were spreading around the world. And then in our phase 3 of you know, mapping and visualizing the news, essentially what we're looking at is what else helps the reader understand what happened or what is happening. So, you know, we started with locating where something's happening. The next step, we added some data to show what's happening in that place. And so this third phase, which is essentially our deadline for these, are sometimes a couple of days, sometimes it's a week, sometimes even a couple weeks of how we can dive further into the news to explain what's going on. And this example isn't a map, but this is an example of using another different graphic or visual to show how coronavirus spreads, and just a simplistic model just to essentially show the like how these things spread. And so this is that example of a phase 3 where we essentially are using a little bit more time we have to dive deeper in, talk to scientists, talk to experts, and figure out how we can visualize the news and what the complexities of what's going on. Obviously, this news story has continued on, and as the last year has passed, we've developed different pieces to help just explain different aspects of it. We have a tracker now that automatically updates, and so this is a very unique example and something where, you know, it's taken that phase 1, 2, and 3, and then it's almost like multiple phase 3s of like, how do we continue to explain what's going on and help readers understand what's going on. So those are different phases of essentially how we map the news, from the quickest turnaround we can do to something that takes a little bit more time. But a lot of our work, especially for the fast turnaround stuff, starts with map templates. So, you know, we do a lot of big long-term projects. We do a lot of projects that are, you know, maybe a couple weeks, a couple months, that are looking in depth at something. But we also have to respond to quick turnaround things, you know, a development that's going on in downtown DC, maybe a locator map locating an area in, for example, Tulsa, Oklahoma, for a story. And so essentially what we have is we have a map template that helps us build a locator map really quickly. Something you might see across these maps, they're all different, but they have certain aspects that are the same that we draw off of from a template, so we can move quickly. The watercolor is the same in these maps. We've also got a green color that we're using for parks. We have type font styles for what we use for water features, for neighborhoods, for streets. We also have icons for highway shield symbols, etc. And, you know, we have our vector maps that we make for these, but we also utilize satellite imagery a lot too. And so in these cases, you know, and this draws on the hierarchy bit that Daniel was talking about, we sometimes fade these satellite imagery pieces back just so you can pull out certain features that are the most important. So we do these locator maps based off of a template using for vector maps, and then sometimes we need to expand that if we need to include Google Earth imagery or satellite imagery as part of the map. And then from that template map, we have cases also where some of these maps need to be expanded a little bit outside of the template. And so these are opportunities where we have our template, we'll rely on that for map labels, oftentimes for the color of water, etc. But then sometimes other map features need to be brought in to help explain the explain the story, explain the landscape of the area that's being mapped. And so for this new river gorge map here, as you notice, the river color is a very different color than the water features we see in the other maps. This was a change made to essentially help that river pop. It's a major feature in this geography. And going through this new national park. The top map, this is one that published just yesterday, I think, or a couple of days ago. And this is a really fun one where I like that it's kind of expanding outside of our template in that it's marking fossil sites, but it's got little like dinosaur footprints on the map to show where the fossil sites are. And so these are examples of, you know, a lot of pieces from these maps draw off of the templates, but due to the story and due to like what the topic is, they expand just slightly outside of that to better improve the hierarchy of the map or better tie into some of the other visuals in the story. This is just a picture from a past presentation from my boss, Tim Miko, who's in the driver's seat of this car. And I like to include this, and this has been a big topic today too, is, you know, this essentially, this little image, it's like the cartography race car of the Washington Post. And this, all of the different stickers on this car are all of the different software our team uses. And so we have a team of over 30 people. And on that team, we have a lot of people that have studied a lot of different things, come from different workplaces, come from different backgrounds. And so some people on our team are more familiar with open source products like QGIS. Others, such as myself, went through kind of traditional GIS through the university training. And so I have always been more familiar with ArcGIS. However, because of familiarity of QGIS with my teammates, I've built that skill. And again, you can see all these different stickers. We're using Mapbox, we're using satellite imagery, we're using Blender, which is an open source software for some 3D rendering. There's a couple other open source softwares on here, but we're really using a wide range of stuff, and it just depends on what people feel most comfortable with, and also like what people's experience and backgrounds are. And so a lot of the same things can be created using a lot of different software. But ultimately, our final products end up typically in Adobe Illustrator, just because of how we publish things. And if it goes into print, if it goes online, that's usually our endpoint. And so that's why we use Illustrator heavily. But in terms of, you know, creating map relief, working with satellite imagery, the different tool options our team uses are kind of endless. But yeah, this is just, our cartography team has grown besides just the 4 of us now. So this is a little outdated, but it's a good example of just the different software that we use. So now just to kind of go through really quickly some of the topics that we cover at the Washington Post that we need to make maps for. So it's a newsroom, we cover a lot of things. And so we have an environment desk, we have a politics desk, we have a local desk, we have business, the list goes on and on. We have a lot of topics, all of those topics relate to the news. And so we oftentimes need to be prepared to make graphics to accompany those stories. And more often actually pitch our own stories to help visually explain news events and what's going on. So in the weather, climate, environment realm, obviously this last year out in the West, there were a lot of very big wildfires that created a horrible amount of damage, and we needed to figure out how to map that, how to also explain the speed at which these fires were moving and how fast they grew. So this is a map that was in the print paper. So just to show, we work on digital stuff, but we also need to make maps for the print paper as well. This was a full page map, and this was made in a day. Sometimes we have more time than others, but this was one that it came together very, very quickly because it needed to go into the next day's newspaper. But the software used for this one, it was a mixture of QGIS, and then ultimately it was brought into Illustrator using a little bit of Photoshop for the relief. But I would say with this relief could have been put together in a GIS software, also marking these lines and whatnot. So it's really, you can use a lot of different tools to create similar effects. Earlier last year, we worked on a project that was looking at the impacts of roads and interstates to wildlife migration, and how essentially Fish and Wildlife Services and wildlife biologists are working towards mitigating those impacts through essentially wildlife overpasses and underpasses. So this project focused on a location out in Western Wyoming. And for this project, this was an interactive scrolling project. So as you scrolled, you followed the path of this pronghorn that was moving through Western Wyoming, and all the different things it encountered, from natural gas fields to interstates to ultimately Interstate 80 at the bottom, and where they're at the southern end of the route, where they're trying to put in different overpasses and underpasses for the wildlife to move through, so that they can continue their migration. But for this project, a lot of the initial work was done in GIS software, and ultimately for the final product, we ended up using Mapbox, which allows you to essentially pan and zoom, scroll through and create some of that. But I'd say you could also use some of like the Esri story map products as well. Again, like, you can do a lot of these things using a lot of different tools. Like, never feel limited by your software. Like, try to tinker with things and see how you can push the software to do things more in like a design realm versus, feeling like you have to do everything only in one software. For this project, so this is an example I mentioned briefly earlier that, if this needs to go into print, I can't just export out a Mapbox interactive map and it'll be okay in the print paper. And so this was one where it required an entirely new map to be built for the print paper. So this is just a really rough mock. I like to show these rough mock-ups because I think they're helpful before you dive into the software. If you're trying to design a map or figure out how to orient things, just doing a really rough sketch can help you get some of the ideas out. And I'll have a few other examples of that. But and so this is the final product for the print one. As you can see, there's no scrolling elements. That's not possible in paper. And so this was another one that, it started in GIS software, came into Illustrator and Photoshop. In terms of hierarchy, the goal was to essentially have the wildlife features, the wildlife migration routes, the GPS routes, the ungulate vehicle collision data pop out the most. And then you've got additional information there, such as underpasses and overpasses. And then obviously the base information, which is there for reference, but isn't the first thing that pops out at you, such as the other highways and interstates in the area, different physical features, etc. Another area we need to cover at the post, of course, is politics. We, of course, did election mapping. We did a lot of primary maps, etc. But there was one project we did last year that was a really interesting one. A very different one was looking at swing states around the US. And so one of our political reporters, David Weigel, identified 10 swing states for the 2020 election. And in this case, I was tasked with essentially creating a political geography of these swing states. And so I'll show this example. This is obviously a Wisconsin crowd. In terms of the regions, I understand there's probably going to be some debate and stuff. I feel like it's absolutely impossible to divide regions up in a way that everyone is happy. But in this case, and for the purpose of this story, these regions were divided up based on past voting history for the different counties, et cetera, for the purposes of the story. And so for this project, I was tasked with essentially mapping the political geography of these 10 states, and was kind of in, we have our templates and whatnot, but in this case was given kind of free reign in figuring out a map style aesthetic for the series. And for this series, I kind of wanted to go with an aesthetic that was similar to a like a pull down map you'd see in like a elementary school classroom or something. So you may recall, like in your classroom, was usually like a US map or maybe a state map that the teacher would have either pulled down or maybe it was all rolled up. But that was kind of the aesthetic I was going for, since we were looking at political geography of these different states. And so to start that exploration process, I kind of put together like a rough mood board. This is just a screenshot that I added in recently that I found when I was digging through past notes. And so if anyone wants to know the sources of these images, please let me know, but they're compiled from different places that I saw on Twitter, also some like historical map archives online and whatnot. But I share this in that I think this can be a great way to kind of explore different design ideas, whether, in your workplace, if you're even all the way down to just trying to figure out changing like a highway shield style or something, looking at what have people done before, what are different ways to do this, etc. And the, as you can see, there's a lot of Wisconsin pieces in here as well. And that was one of the first states we were doing. And so there's a lot of great cartographers and mappers and GIS folks that come out of Wisconsin. And so I wanted to kind of draw off of that and what people have done. And so I put together a mood board. On the left, as you can see, different kind of color styles from those like political maps or regional maps. And then to kind of like tie that all together, a lot of these maps had different kind of like handwritten elements. At one point I had this grand plan that I was going to draw out all of these maps. I had to make one of these a week for timeline. So we had 10 maps. It was 10 weeks of coverage. And so every week was a new map. And so I ended up trying out some hand-drawn stuff, and I ended up, using vector lines for counties that came out of GIS software to mark the counties and state shapes and whatnot. But I did make my own kind of handwritten font that I then scanned and brought into Illustrator, which allows you to essentially vectorize things. If I had more time, I would have actually made this a font. I actually reached out to Sarah about this early in this project, and I ran out of time essentially. So I ended up hand placing letters, which I don't recommend. But just saying this as an example, like font stuff can be really, really cool to experiment with. And then for each of these two, one of the tasks was also to essentially like illustrate a symbol to represent each of these regions. How I researched this was I reached out to different people in the newsroom. So every week, if you were from Texas, if you were from Ohio, you were getting a Slack message from me asking like, how different areas like are represented. And so I tried to cast a wide net because everyone has different thoughts about different regions, especially when it's your hometown or your home state or your home county. So each week I had out my sketch pad and was drawing these, and I'm not an illustrator. This is just like, these are like the final editions of a lot of very rough sketches. And then in the end, these all came together again in Illustrator because this is how we end up publishing our stuff. But essentially all those fonts and illustrations I scanned and brought into Illustrator, gave them different colors to tie into the different regions. And these are all of the different kind of promo images for these brought together. But if you want to explore, these are all online, and each state has its own webpage that you can scroll through. And then this is an example of eventually from digital, it needed to make its way into print. And so this was a case where it didn't need to make a completely new map, but essentially I needed to reformat things a little bit, essentially to make it work for print. I couldn't have like a rolling GIF. I couldn't have it scrolling to turn things on and off. And so this is just another example of how it kind of evolved to print. For foreign, we do a lot of maps and different graphics for foreign. This is a story that we worked on last year, looking at around the world, how coronavirus was impacting different countries, different people. And so this was looking at how coronavirus was impacting remittances from workers in other countries, sending money back to their home countries. And for this, I had a data set, I had country to country data. And so, being a geographer, I was like, okay, like let's start with a map. Of course it's gonna be a map. And and I got halfway through this map. This obviously isn't finished. And I was like, I'm running out of space. Like a lot of these countries are grouped together. A lot of them are very small, and very little pieces of this are gonna be highlighted versus like this vast geography. And so I backed up. I did what I tell everyone to do, but I often need to remind myself, as I just like went back to a sketch pad, and I ended up just sketching it out essentially to make it as like a flow chart. So rather than taking up the space with the world map and only highlighting a few countries, I stepped back to figure out how I could orient these labels in roughly their geographic location. I say roughly because obviously these aren't ordered exactly, but they're roughly in their geographic order, and then how money flows between the countries. And so from paper, I took this into Illustrator, and I feel more comfortable in Illustrator, but I know I have coworkers that could make the same thing and using code, using D3. And so like, again, this doesn't have to be made in Illustrator. There are many ways to make this, but this was my first go. I then moved on to adding essentially that data in. So using like line width to show like how money was flowing. And then refined it a little bit more. I was really hooked on these like arrows, these flow arrows, but eventually my editor was like, let's get rid of them. And it was a very good decision. And this is also like, you know, sharing work with your coworkers, sharing work that you're working on to get like design ideas is a really great way to like kind of fine tune things as well. So I always encourage people to share their work. And then a little bit more fine tuning to essentially get those labels out. So it's a little bit less busy, a little bit, the labeling is a little bit cleaner. And then this is another chart that ended up going in that piece as well, that was showing money flowing into India, which was the focus country for the story. And then lastly, local. This is an area that, you know, we're based in Washington, D.C., so we're covering a lot of local topics, but local also, our local desk also covers social issues, transportation, education coverage for the nation. So it catches a wide umbrella of things. But one of the projects I worked on a couple years ago that I wanted to share, because it's an example of like bringing like archive data into GIS and then bringing it, working on designing it. So essentially a couple years ago was the 50th anniversary of the 1968 riots in DC. And we were tasked with mapping the events that took place over the 4 days in DC. And this started with a lot of archival maps. And obviously like in the 1960s, there wasn't like, you know, there wasn't a GIS file of this that we could just like download and throw into our GIS software. And so in this case, I ended up having to digitize or georeference all of these dots. And so our final product was in Mapbox. And so did a little bit of Mapbox base map design, which obviously you can do some of this in ArcGIS Online as well. And then I ended up georeferencing from these maps. And so for this example, I used a Map Publisher, which is an Adobe Illustrator plugin. But I only use that because that was what I felt more comfortable with. You could easily do this in QGIS. I've done it many times in ArcGIS as well. And so I assume many of you have done a lot of georeferencing and whatnot, or are familiar with it. But that's where we got the data for this project. And then the full project, this project I should highlight too, was more of the long-term one. So this was one that we worked on for a couple of months. So we had the time to digitize those points from archival data or archival maps and whatnot. So we had all those dots georeferenced. We brought them into Mapbox so that they could animate or scroll through the rest of the story. And you know, during this whole process too, researching the data, we also came across this interesting cartographic design in these maps from the 1950s, 1960s. Washington, D.C. was always rotated with north in the top left. So right now in this map, D.C. appears almost like a square. North is in that top left corner, and so it's actually tilted. And this was really cool in that we wanted to bring this essentially to the print version of this project. And so again, we couldn't turn those scrolling maps into a print map, and so that required a fully new map to be developed. And so what we did was we drew inspiration from these old maps, which, similar to the political geography project, it can be fun, even if it's down to just looking for inspiration in a map symbol for something you're working on. I think looking to what other people are doing, looking to past maps can be a really great way to kind of explore different cartographic and mapping elements. We had a little chart to accompany the map. Little red dots to essentially show these were Secret Service calls that were made during the riots. And one thing also to highlight too, and going back to the hierarchy discussion Daniel was mentioning, is for this one too, we wanted the data to pop. And so what we ended up doing was using inspiration from those old 1960s maps was we kept the thematic data, the only element that was in color, and then everything else was in like grayscale, black and white, et cetera, to really essentially to really have the data pop as the first thing that you saw. And then Daniel mentioned he doesn't put north arrows and scale bars on his maps and stuff. We kind of do the same thing. We do include scale bars, but We don't include a north arrow unless the map is rotated. And so in this case, the map was rotated with DC or north up in the northwest. And so what we did was we drew on inspiration from the old 1960s map to make this bold north arrow pop so that people were able to orient themselves a bit easier. I'm just going to share these really quick. Feel free to screenshot if you'd like. I can also send them to Culture to share around. But these are just some, I mentioned a couple of times looking for inspiration for anywhere from map colors to map, symbology, all those things. These are some of the places I really like to go to for inspiration. So these are 3. This is another 3, and this isn't at all limited. These are just kind of my bookmarks tab, but I like to share these as places to go kind of find map inspiration. And I went a little bit longer than I expected. I apologize, but always feel free to reach out if you have questions or you're not able to ask today. And thank you, Culture, for having me, and thank you, Daniel and Sarah, and thank you all for having me to talk today. This has been great. Thank you.
Thank you, Lauren. I think the stories and your workflows going into these maps and the nuggets of inspiration that we can grab as someone who buys art books in part to inspire projects. I think it's worth every second you think you went over. That's my bias though. Anybody have questions or things they want to hear more about from Lauren? We've got about 10 minutes yet. Feel free to unmute or type it in the chat box. Either way is fine. I am hearing the late afternoon crickets, which aren't very loud. I mean, I don't know that I have so much a question, but certainly a real appreciation for, and I mean, again, a little bit of this is my interning time at the Geographic and knowing that at the commission where I work now, there has to be a bit of that templated approach. And I really like your description of in my eyes, the 3 tiers. And I think you said it that way as well, between your very short term, short turnaround, medium turnaround, and then the longer developing projects. And I'm, not as familiar with how other states and counties or other state agencies and counties and municipalities, how they do their stuff. I guess I'm wondering, maybe even pointing out at the crowd, do you have similar workflows to get your unique work done? Or is it something that really hasn't crossed your mind yet? That didn't nudge anything either. Oh, wait.
Sure it did.
Oh,
Sure
why
it
not?
did.
Yes. Speak up, Joe. Let's hear it.
I think that it depends on the circumstances. Hey, I have a meeting in 2 days and you need to come up with a map. Thanks for letting me know. Or one of those kinds of things where you have a little bit longer. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And everybody has longer term projects wherever they work. And I think that allows for greater creativity. And then you can go look around and perhaps throw some of those ideas in. And what I liked about Lauren's presentation specifically was her discussion about every tool can be used to improve every type of map. It's how much you know about it and how much work you put into it. So that was useful. Thank you.
It looks like we have a question in the chat. When a map is destined for both online, interactive, dynamic, and paper versions, which is generally developed first and the other adapted from it? That's a really good question. And I've worked in essentially both, but flip-flopped. So at National Geographic, because it's a magazine and it was, the production process depended on when a story was running a particular month. We would essentially make the print version first. And then it was usually a couple months from when those files were sent to the printer to getting to your doorstep on the magazine to essentially work on the digital product. At one point it was focused on iPad, like Culture was mentioning. Now it's more just kind of inline maps and whatnot in an article. And so in that case, that was, when I worked there, it was making print and then adapting for digital. At the Washington Post, everything is made for online first. And so these interactive maps are being built over the course of weeks or days or weeks or months in some cases. And then the print deadline is sometimes like a day or two. And so I try to, if I have like the mental capacity, I try to kind of in the back of my head as I'm like making a map that's going online, or I'm putting data on like an interactive scrolling map. I'm trying to think like, okay, how am I going to get this into print? And what helps is I started as a print cartographer. And so like, that's already kind of like in my head, but it's not easy. And so sometimes like with the 1968 project, we were so focused on getting that out that I didn't really have time to think about it, about like the print process until maybe 4 days before. And that involved a couple paper sketches. And then that print map was made in like a day or two. So typically it's like one before the other, but like in the best case scenario, it's nice if you have the brain space for it to like kind of try to think or note some ideas as you're like making one versus the other, if you need to like transition it the other way around at some point.
Good question, John. Anything else out there? Or else we can open it up to more general questions as well with the last few minutes that we have.
Sarah, you mentioned that if you have ArcGIS online, that the Adobe Creative Suite is that included in the ArcGIS online licensing?
No, so if you, that's a good question. If you have ArcGIS Online license, you have access to Maps for Adobe Creative Cloud, which is a plugin that can be installed into your Adobe Creative Cloud suite. So yeah, Adobe is its own separate thing, separate company. But yeah, we have just created an extension that can be used to extend it to a mapping application. Good question.
I'm surprised I didn't get comments on the Wisconsin region breakdown.
Critique hounds get started. I will say, I did think, oh, go ahead, Chris. Go ahead, whoever was going.
Where is central Wisconsin? Where?
Christina's posed this one on me before, Lauren. Would you like to say something about central Wisconsin, Christine?
Just born and raised, and now I don't know where I fit. That's okay, I'm just teasing. It was great.
Yeah.
There were some states in that breakdown. There was a central region or sometimes multiple, but not Wisconsin. It's kind of like, yeah, it's all divided up kind of like a pie.
Well, I mean, and I think politically, and I'm talking in totally anecdotal terms. It's like, I mean, yeah, I totally sat there and compared your county lines and thought about, well, how is Eau Claire County different from Chippewa County, two counties that straddle a boundary that I'm very familiar with. And I mean, honestly, if I were in your position, Lauren, there was maybe one county that I scratched my head over on a 72, and I think that's pretty darn good for anybody. Not that I'm any more qualified than anyone else, because I'm not, but I think for what you were going for, it was really well done.
Oh,
yes, Christine, central Wisconsin is its own region.
I wholly agree with Lauren.
I know.
There's no way she could have diced that up and made everybody happy.
Yeah. Yeah.
What she did do is, it was nice.
That's one of the first lessons I learned in mapping.
Go ahead.
They're so personal, maps are. You could be mapping exactly. Well, one of my first maps that I made was an interactive map about climbing related incidents on Mount Rainier. And mapping actual fact of incidents, but the emotion that it evoked on climbers, you know, people loved it, people hated it. It's just like maps can be so emotional. It's a good lesson.
I think that reminds me of one of the most common comments that I see that I've received both on my maps and I've seen applied to lots of other people's work when, you know, it gets out there in sort of the wider public outside the cartosphere. And people will say things like, "Oh, you forgot this river," or "You forgot this town," because they're always sort of like they're tuned in. The first thing I always look for is, well, this is the area that's familiar to me, kind of thing. So it's always a good thing to remember that, yeah, people live here and they're very attuned to how you're electing to represent the places that are special to them.
We do have another question in the chat box. Lauren, I may have missed it after you mentioned the half-hour to hour quick turnaround with maps, but do you have other definable time limits to other long-term projects other than the deadlines themselves? That comes from Carrie.
Yeah, and I think it depends. So do you have definable time limits to other long-term projects? So again, it depends. So like the 1968 example, we needed to publish that before the 50th anniversary. And so that was kind of like, we needed to back up, like, how long is this going to take for what we're trying to do, and back up a couple months. Sometimes we're responding to the news and we're just trying to move as quickly as possible. And so sometimes that's doing stuff in that short period of time. But sometimes the time we can do it and depends on like data availability. Are the shape files like easily downloadable from online? Do we need to reach out to someone to get this data, et cetera? And sometimes too, sometimes we have projects that we have kind of a planned timeline on, but sometimes we need to push past that if it's not necessarily pegged to like a specific like anniversary or news event timeline, but just kind of like a general time of year, or it's something that is, no matter what day it is, it's going to be an important project to publish. And so in that case, you know, we might have like a goal deadline, but we sometimes will push it back if, you know, if we can spend another week on something to make it even better and we have that time for that project, we will do that on occasion too. This isn't a project that I showed in this presentation, but a project that we published a couple years ago was looking at Bears Ears National Monument, and it was mapping the areas that were now excluded from the original national monument. And that was something that had been kind of an ongoing news story, and it wasn't pegged to a particular date. Essentially, it was an important story to tell no matter what. And that was one where we ended up publishing it a week or two later than we had planned, just because we felt if we spent that extra week or two, we could just take it like one step further, essentially. Hopefully that helps answer that question.
Excellent. So we are a little bit past 4 and we have folks that are starting to drop off. I know there's basically a county government mappers meeting that is happening or just starting as we speak, the Lion meeting as it's known. I don't know if the three of you have more time to listen to folks if they do have questions. Otherwise, we can set up to wrap up. I guess it's up to the three of you if we want to stick around. I also don't know what other questions may come. We can otherwise just wrap things up. I think a wrap is okay.
Yeah, I think
Daniel,
that's fine with me.
Yeah. I think, I mean, you all were awesome. The work to see was just astounding. And from my point of view, I'll probably reach out later and try to be in touch with some of the stuff that you all are doing. So speaking for myself, speaking for everyone, lots of folks in the chat, thank you so much for being part of the workshop today. It was wonderful to have you all and wonderful to have the discussion with everybody who's been here. So thank you all so much.
Thank you. This was fun.
Thanks for being here.
Yep.
Thank you all. This is great.
Awesome. Enjoy the rest of the conference, everybody who's going to be around this week. And certainly, and I mean, I'll arrange with the three of you to grab whatever slides or content you'd like to share, and we can go from there.